Listen here now, children. Gather round this fire of remembrance where the smoke still carries the cries of them who suffered. I'm going to tell you about a woman named Nora, born under Georgia's sun in the year of our Lord 1832, when the cotton fields stretched white as bone and the whip cracked louder than thunder. This ain't no fairy tale for soft hearts. No, sir. This here's a testimonio of blood and thread, of words spoken in rage and lips sewn shut in punishment. Down at Willow Bend Plantation, where the red clay drinks deep and the Chattahoochee River runs slow with secrets, there lived a woman who dared speak truth to power. They called her uppity. They called her defiant. But her name was Nora, and what happened to her lips became legend in them slave quarters, whispered under moonlight meetings, passed down through generations like a prayer and a warning both. Lord have mercy on what I'm about to tell you. For this is the story of how one woman's tongue brought down the overseer's wrath, how needle and thread became instruments of torture, and how silence itself became the loudest scream ever heard on that cursed plantation ground. Now you see, people, this ain't just history written in books. This is memory carved in flesh, stitched in pain, carried in the souls of our ancestors who crossed that terrible water in chains. So sit still, listen deep, and don't look away, for them who suffered deserve to be remembered true. The morning Nora's world shifted started quiet-like, deceptively peaceful as the dove's call that echoed through the magnolia trees surrounding the big house. She stood in the dining room of Master Elijah Hawthorne's mansion, her dark hands moving careful over the silver candlesticks, polishing till they caught the early light streaming through tall windows. Her reflection stared back at her. A young woman of 23 years, skin like polished ebony, eyes that carried fire the mistress said was dangerous in a slave. "Nora, you dreamin' again?" Old Hannah whispered from the doorway, her wrinkled face showing worry lines deep as river valleys. The elder house slave knew that faraway look in Nora's eyes meant trouble brewing. But Nora wasn't dreaming. She was remembering. In them days of deep sorrow, when she was but 7 years old, they'd taken her mama to the auction block in Savannah. Nora could still hear it, that terrible wailing that cut through the humid Georgia air like a knife through butter. Her mama, Sarah, standing on that wooden platform while white men circled like buzzards, poking at her teeth, examining her like livestock. The auctioneer's voice booming, "Fine breeder here, gentlemen, strong-backed woman, good hips, healthy as an ox." Nora had screamed till her throat bled. She'd clawed at the hands holding her back. But heavy chains don't break for a child's tears, and a mother's love can't stop the hammer falling on a sale. Sold to the gentleman from Louisiana for $800. That was the last time Nora saw her mama's face. Folks swear on their lives they seen Sarah being dragged onto a flatboat headed down the Mississippi, still calling Nora's name. But the river swallowed those cries just like it swallowed so many others. "Girl, you hear me?" Hannah hissed again, sharper this time. "Mistress Catherine gonna skin you alive if she catch you wool gathering." Nora blinked hard, pushing down the memory like you'd push down a coffin lid. "Yes'm, I hear you." She'd learned her letters in secret from old Peter, the stable hand who remembered the old African tongues, and could read some too. Late at night in the quarters, by candlelight so dim you could barely see, he'd scratched words in the dirt floor. Knowledge was forbidden fruit for slaves, but Nora ate it hungry-like, storing each word in her heart like precious stones. The crash came sudden as lightning. Nora's hands, slick with polish, lost their grip. The silver candlestick fell, hit the mahogany table, then crashed to the floor with a sound that seemed to shake the whole big house. Silence of death followed, that terrible quiet before punishment falls. Mistress Catherine appeared in the doorway like a pale ghost, her face twisted with fury. "You clumsy nigger. That candlestick belonged to my grandmother. I'm sorry, mistress, Sorry, don't fix broken silver." The mistress's voice rose shrill. Elijah. Master Hawthorne came thundering down the stairs, Bible in one hand as always. He was a tall man with cold blue eyes that could freeze your soul. "What's this commotion? Your house slave broke my grandmother's candlestick. I want her punished proper." The master looked at Nora with something worse than anger. disappointment, like she'd confirmed every low thing he believed about her kind. "Nora, you've been getting above yourself lately. Caught you looking at my books last week. Too much pride for a slave. Time you learned your place proper." Heart in throat, Nora felt the words forming. But she swallowed them down. Not yet. Not here. "Send her to the fields," Master Hawthorne pronounced. "Let Silas Crow teach her humility under the cotton sun. Maybe a month picking will cure her of her uppity ways." And just like that, Nora's world turned. She was stripped of her house privileges and marched out to the slave quarters, where the real suffering lived. As she walked the dusty path toward them rough cabins, she saw him for the first time up close, Silas Crow, the overseer, sitting tall on his black stallion. He smiled at her, slow and cruel, like a snake sighting prey. "Welcome to the fields, gal," he drawled, tobacco juice running down his chin. "I've been hearing you got spirit. Well, I got ways of breaking spirit. You gonna learn real quick out here." That night in the dark quarters, lying on hard ground covered only by a thin blanket, Nora heard the other slaves whispering. And in that whispering, she heard her future calling like a voice from the grave. The first morning bell rang while darkness still clung to the quarters like a burial shroud. Nora woke to the sound of chains rattling, bodies stirring, souls preparing for another day of bondage under that skin and heat. "Up now, girl," said a woman's voice, gentle but firm. "Sun gonna rise whether you ready or not, and Crow don't wait for nobody." Nora opened her eyes to see an old woman standing over her, face carved with suffering, eyes still bright as morning stars. This was Aunt Ruth, root doctor and keeper of the old ways. Folks whispered she could curse a man just by looking at him crossways, could heal with herbs the white doctor couldn't name. "I'm Nora. I know who you is, child. Whole plantation know about the house slave who broke the mistress's silver." Aunt Ruth handed her a piece of hard cornbread. "Eat quick. Field work ain't like dust and furniture. You gonna need strength." In them days of deep sorrow, the cotton fields stretched endless under the merciless Georgia sky. Row after row of white bowls waiting to be picked, each one hiding thorns that tore at your fingers till they bled. The overseer's horn sounded, and 200 slaves moved like a dark tide toward the fields. Nora found herself placed in a line between Aunt Ruth and a young man about her age, lean and strong-backed, with eyes that seemed to see past the horizon. "Name's Josiah," he said softly, his hands already moving quick through the cotton. "Don't let Crow see you talking." He liked to make examples. The sun rose higher, turning the world into a furnace of heat and pain. Nora's fingers, used to delicate silver polish, now bled from cotton thorns. Her back screamed from the constant bending. Sweat poured down her face like tears, mixing with the red dust that covered everything. But worse than the pain was the singing, them work songs that carried all the sorrow of a people in chains. Voices rose in haunting harmony. "Swing low, sweet chariot, comin' for to carry me home." The words hit Nora like fists. This was her mama's song. Sarah used to hum it while braiding Nora's hair, back when they still had each other. Now it was sung by bent backs in endless fields, a prayer for deliverance that might never come. "Keep moving!" The crack of the whip cut the air. Silas Crow rode through the rows on his black stallion, cruel eyes searching for weakness. "Y'all pick like you sleepin'. I want them sacks filled 'fore noon or taste leather." Nora straightened up just as Crow rode past. Their eyes met for one burning second. She saw the evil in him plain as day, the kind of wickedness that takes pleasure in another's pain. "Well, well," Crow drawled, pulling his horse to a stop right beside her. "If it ain't our new field hand. How you likin' the cotton house, nigger? Miss your soft life polishin' silver?" The other slaves went quiet. Even the singing stopped. Lord have mercy, everyone knew what was coming. "Answer me when I speak to you, gal." "I'm working, sir," Nora said through gritted teeth. "Sir?" Crow laughed, a sound like bones breaking. "You hear that, boys? She call me sir like she's some kind of lady." He leaned down from his horse, his breath hot and stinking of whiskey. "You ain't nothing but property, understand? Less than a horse, less than a dog. You just a working animal, and I'm the man who makes sure you work." Something flickered in Nora's chest, a flame her mama had lit years ago, fed by every injustice, every stolen child, every drop of blood the plantation ground had drunk. But she swallowed it down. Not yet. Not here. But Crow saw it. Oh, he saw that fire in her eyes, and it made him smile wider. "You got spirit, I'll give you that. But don't worry, I got ways of breaking spirit. Just you wait." As he rode away, Josiah whispered without looking at her, "Be careful. That man ain't human. He pure devil." Aunt Ruth added, her voice heavy with knowing. "Meddled where he shouldn't, that overseer. The ancestors watching him close. Man like that always get his due in the end." But Nora barely heard them. She was staring at Crow's back, her hands clenching the cotton till her bleeding fingers went numb. And in the silence of her heart, she whispered a vow that would change everything. "You gonna regret this one way or another, you gonna pay." The sun beat down. The whip cracked. The singing resumed. And deep in Nora's chest, rebellion took root like a seed planted in blood-soaked ground. 3 days passed like 3 lifetimes under that burning sun. 3 days of Nora's hands bleeding into the cotton, her back screaming with every bend, her soul raging against the chains she couldn't see but felt wrapped tight around her spirit. The old ones warned us that pride comes before the fall, but sometimes a soul gets so full of fire that falling becomes the only way to fly. Now listen here, child, 'cause this is where everything changed. It was the 4th day when the heat rose so fierce that even the buzzards stopped circling overhead. The air hung thick and heavy, like breathing through wet wool. In the cotton fields of Willow Bend, 200 souls moved slow as molasses, their songs reduced to whispered prayers. The earth itself seemed to groan under the weight of so much suffering. Silas Crow rode through the rows like death on horseback, his whip coiled at his side like a sleeping serpent. That morning he'd already lashed 2 men for slowness, left 1 woman bleeding for spilling water, and sold a boy of 12 down river for sass. The devil's man was in a foul mood and everyone knew it. Folks ran like shadows trying to stay out his path. But fate has a way of putting people exactly where they need to be, even when it leads straight to hell. Nora worked her row with Josiah on one side and Aunt Ruth on the other. Her cotton sack was near full, fingers raw and bleeding, dress soaked through with sweat. The sun stood directly overhead, turning the world white hot. No breeze stirred, no bird sang, just the endless scrape of hands through cotton and the distant crack of the whip. "Water break!" someone called down the line. The slaves straightened slowly, joints popping, backs protesting. They shuffled toward the water barrel at the field's edge like wounded soldiers retreating from battle. Nora dipped the tin cup and drank deep, the lukewarm water tasting like salvation despite being thick with clay. That's when she heard it, the sound that made her blood run cold. Hoofbeats, coming fast. Crow appeared through the shimmering heat like a vision from nightmare, his black stallion kicking up red dust. He reined in hard at the water barrel, his shadow falling across the gathered slaves like a burial shroud. "Break time's over," he barked, spitting tobacco juice that landed near Nora's feet. "Y'all move like crippled mules. Master Hawthorne expect 50 pounds per hand by sundown, and most of y'all ain't got 30. Back to work, you lazy niggers." The slaves scattered, fear moving their tired bodies faster than strength could. But Nora's feet felt rooted to the red clay earth. Something in his voice, that casual cruelty, that assumption of absolute power struck a chord deep in her chest where her mama's memory lived. "You deaf, gal?" Crow's eyes fixed on her, cold as a snake's. "I said move." Nora started to turn, but her movements were too slow, too deliberate. The fire in her belly had been building for days, fed by every insult, every injustice, every memory of loss. "Matter of fact," Crow continued, a cruel smile spreading across his weathered face, "you been dragging behind since you got here. Uppity house nigger thinking she too good for field work. Well, I got news for you, gal. You ain't special. You just another working animal, and not a very good one at that." In them days of deep sorrow, there were words you learned to swallow. Insults you digested like poison, letting them burn your insides rather than spit them back. Every slave knew this dance. The careful choreography of submission that kept skin on your back and breath in your lungs. But sometimes the cup overflows. "Pick up that hoe," Crow ordered, pointing to a tool lying in the dust. "Since you can't pick cotton worth a damn, maybe you can chop weeds. Get on your knees and start working." That last command, "get on your knees," something about it broke the dam Nora had been building inside her soul. She thought of her mama on the auction block, forced to her knees to be examined. She thought of all the women violated in the dark quarters, forced to their knees by masters and overseers. She thought of her ancestors in the holds of slave ships, chained and broken, brought low by men who saw them as less than human. Her heart beat like African drums, pounding out a rhythm of rebellion passed down through blood and bone. Nora straightened her back, lifted her chin, and looked Silas Crow dead in his cold eyes. "No," she said, her voice quiet but clear as a bell. The field went silent as the grave. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Folks swear on their lives that in that moment you could hear the ancestors stirring in the red Georgia clay, recognizing one of their own standing tall. Crow's face went from surprise to rage in the span of a heartbeat. "What did you say to me?" The words rose in Nora's throat like fire, like flood, like all the pain of the Middle Passage crying out for justice. She couldn't stop them any more than you can stop a river once the dam breaks. "I said no!" Her voice rang out across the cotton field. "You ain't no boss, you a thief. A thief of souls, a stealer of lives. You steal our sweat, our blood, our very breath. You work us till we drop, whip us till we bleed, sell our children like cattle." The slaves around her gasped. Josiah grabbed her arm, whispering urgent, "Nora, stop. Lord have mercy, stop." But she was past stopping. The ancestors had her tongue now, speaking through her mouth words that needed saying even if they cost everything. "My mama was sold on the auction block in Savannah. My people crossed the terrible water in chains, breathe in death and darkness. And for what? So men like you can ride high on stolen labor? So you can play God with lives that ain't yours to take?" Nora's voice rose higher, powered by generations of grief. "Well, I curse you, Silas Crow. I call on the spirits of them who drowned in the Atlantic, them who hung from trees, them who died in these very fields. May they haunt your days and torment your nights. May the earth reject your bones when you die. May your name be forgotten and your soul wander restless for eternity." The words hung in the scorching air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Crow sat frozen on his horse, his face purple with fury, veins bulging in his neck. Around them, slaves stood paralyzed between terror and awe. Some wept, some whispered prayers. Aunt Ruth's lips moved in silent incantation, calling on powers older than slavery itself. Then Crow smiled, a terrible, chilling smile that promised suffering beyond imagination. "Boys," he said quietly to the two field drivers nearby, his voice deadly calm, "take this nigger to the barn. Now." His whip uncoiled like a living thing. "You want to run your mouth, gal? You want to curse me? Well, let's see how much you can say when I'm done with you." Rough hands grabbed Nora's arms. She didn't resist as they dragged her away from the fields, away from the shocked faces of her fellow slaves, toward the barn where shadows held worse horrors than the sun's glare. Behind her, Josiah fought against the hands holding him back, shouting her name. Aunt Ruth's voice rose in a prayer song that sounded like mourning, and overhead, the buzzards began circling again, drawn by the scent of blood about to be spilled. As they pulled Nora toward the barn's dark entrance, she caught one last glimpse of the cotton fields, white as bone, red clay stained with generations of tears. The barn door opened like a mouth waiting to swallow her whole. And in that moment before darkness claimed her, Nora felt something unexpected bloom in her chest. Not regret, not yet, but a fierce pride that she had spoken truth to power, even knowing the terrible price that truth would cost. The barn door slammed shut behind her with the finality of a coffin lid, and that's when hell truly opened up. Now you see, people, what I'm about to tell you ain't easy to speak on, but the ancestors demand we remember true. Not the sanitized version in white folks' history books, but the raw, bloody truth of what bondage really meant. So I ask you to steel your hearts and listen close, for this is where Nora learned that words have weight, and some prices are paid in flesh. The barn at Willow Bend Plantation stood at the edge of the quarters, a hulking structure of weathered wood and shadows. Inside, it smelled of hay and horse dung, leather and old blood, the accumulated scent of years of punishment dealt in darkness where the big house couldn't see. They threw Nora down onto the dirt floor, her body hitting hard enough to knock the wind from her lungs. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through cracks in the walls, she saw the whipping post in the corner, its wood stained dark with the blood of countless backs. Saw the chains hanging from rafters. Saw the tools of torture lined up neat as surgeons' instruments. Silas Crow dismounted slow and deliberate, his boots hitting the ground with the finality of a judge's gavel. He removed his hat, wiped sweat from his brow, and smiled that terrible smile again. "Round 'em up," he ordered the field drivers. "Every slave on this plantation gonna witness this. Let 'em all see what happens when you forget your place." Lord have mercy on what came next. Within 30 minutes, they'd assembled nearly 200 souls outside the barn. Men, women, children, all forced to watch. The elderly were dragged from their sick beds. Nursing mothers came with babies at their breasts. Even the house slaves were marched down from the big house, Master Hawthorne himself coming to oversee the lesson. Nora knelt in the dirt, her wrists bound behind her back, two strong field hands holding her shoulders to keep her from moving. She could see Josiah in the crowd, tears streaming down his face. Could see Aunt Ruth standing stone still, her lips moving in silent prayer. Could see the fear in every eye, the way folks looked away, unable to bear witness but forced to all the same. "This here nigger," Crow announced to the assembled crowd, his voice carrying across the heavy silence, "thought she could insult me. Thought she could curse me like some kind of conjure woman. Thought her words had power." He walked in a slow circle around Nora, performing for his captive audience. "Well, I'm here to teach y'all a lesson about power. Real power. The kind that comes from this." He held up his whip. "And this." He pulled out a knife, its blade catching the afternoon light. Nora's heart hammered against her ribs like a bird trying to escape a cage. But she kept her chin up, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the barn, beyond Georgia, beyond this nightmare of bondage. "But I ain't gonna whip her," Crow said, and a confused murmur ran through the crowd. "No, that's too common, too quick. This uppity bitch needs something special, something that'll last." From his pocket, he pulled out a needle, thick and curved, the kind used for sewing leather harnesses, and a spool of coarse black thread. In them days of deep sorrow, we learned that cruelty has no bottom. Just when you think you've seen the worst humanity can offer, someone shows you a new depth of depravity. "Hold her head still," Crow ordered. The hands on Nora's shoulders moved to grip her skull, fingers digging into her scalp. She tried to shake free, but they held her firm as iron. Her eyes went wide with understanding and terror. "No," she whispered. "Please, no." "Oh, now you beggin'?" Crow laughed, kneeling down in front of her. Where was all that cursing spirit now? Where's all them big words about stolen souls and wandering spirits? He threaded the needle with movements practiced and calm, like a seamstress preparing to mend a torn dress. "You want to run that mouth so bad? You want to speak curses and throw insults? Well, let's see how much talking you do when I'm finished." Aunt Ruth's voice rose above the crowd, powerful as thunder. "The ancestors see this wickedness. The earth remembers every drop of innocent blood. You mark my words, Crow, you gonna pay for this evil." "Shut that old woman up or she's next," Crow snarled. Two men grabbed Aunt Ruth, holding her back as she fought like a woman half her age, still calling down spiritual fire on the overseer's head. Crow turned back to Nora, his face so close she could smell the whiskey on his breath, see the yellow in his teeth. "This is gonna hurt something terrible," he whispered almost conversationally. "But you brought it on yourself. Remember that." The first pierce of the needle through her lower lip felt like lightning striking her face. Nora's scream tore from her throat, raw and animal, echoing across the plantation like a declaration of war against God himself. Blood welled up, hot and copper-tasting, filling her mouth. "Hold her steady," Crow barked as Nora thrashed. "Can't sew straight if she keeps moving." The needle went through again and again, in and out, pulling the thick black thread through tender flesh. Each pierce brought fresh agony, fresh blood, fresh understanding of how much the human body can suffer and still keep breathing. Children in the crowd buried their faces in their mothers' skirts. Men wept openly. Women fell to their knees praying. And through it all, the terrible rhythmic pierce of needle through flesh continued. Nora's upper lip now, the thread pulling tight, drawing her mouth closed bit by bit. She couldn't scream anymore, could only make muffled sounds of anguish that somehow hurt worse to hear than the screams had been. Blood ran down her chin, dripped onto her dress, mixed with tears and snot and the saliva she couldn't swallow. The pain was fire spreading across her face, up into her skull, down into her very soul. Her body shook with shock and suffering. And listen close now, for this is important. Even in that moment of ultimate degradation, something in Nora refused to break. Her eyes, those streaming tears, still blazed with that same fire that had made her speak truth in the first place. The ancestors lived in those eyes, bearing witness, refusing to bow. 7 stitches, Crow announced, tying off the final thread with a flourish. 7 days of silence. 7 days to think about the consequences of running your mouth to your betters. He stood up, wiping Nora's blood from his hands onto his pants. "Let this be a lesson to all of y'all. I don't care if you're field hand or house slave, man or woman, young or old. You belong to Master Hawthorne, and you answer to me. Step out of line and you'll pay the price." Master Hawthorne himself stepped forward then, his Bible clutched to his chest, his voice booming with religious authority. "The good book says, 'Slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling.' This woman forgot her scripture, forgot her place. Now she'll remember." They cut the ropes binding Nora's wrists and hauled her to her feet. She swayed, dizzy with pain and blood loss, her lips already swelling around the cruel stitches. The world spun and darkened at the edges. Through the crowd parted a path back to the quarters, a gauntlet of horrified faces, of pity and fear mixed together. Nora walked it alone, each step an act of will, her swollen, sewn mouth a testimony to the price of defiance. Josiah tried to reach her, but guards blocked his way. Aunt Ruth broke free and rushed to Nora's side, supporting her weight, whispering in her ear, "You ain't alone, child. The ancestors walk with you. This pain gonna pass, but your courage, that's eternal." They reached Nora's cabin as the sun began its descent, painting the sky blood red. Aunt Ruth laid her gently on the rough pallet, brought cool water and clean rags, began the careful work of tending wounds that went deeper than flesh. 7 days, Crow had said. 7 days of silence, of pain, of learning regret. But as Nora lay there in the gathering darkness, her face on fire and her mouth sealed shut, she discovered something unexpected. Regret. Yes, it was there, gnawing at her like hunger. But beneath it ran a current of fierce, unbreakable pride. She had spoken truth. She had named the evil. She had called it out loud and clear for all to hear. And that truth, once spoken, could never be unspoken, no matter how many stitches sealed her lips. Outside, night fell heavy on Willow Bend Plantation. And in the slave quarters, whispers began to spread about the woman who dared curse the overseer, about her sewn lips and blazing eyes, about courage that even needles couldn't thread shut. Nora's ordeal had just begun, but so had her legend. The first night came down heavy as a shroud over the slave quarters at Willow Bend. Nora lay on her rough pallet, her face swollen to twice its normal size, lips pulled tight by cruel black thread that caught the dim candlelight like spider's silk. Every heartbeat sent fresh waves of fire through her jaw. Every breath brought copper-tasting blood, and the knowledge that this was only the beginning. Listen here now, children, for this is where suffering becomes teacher, and silence becomes its own kind of voice. Aunt Ruth sat beside her through that long darkness, bathing Nora's face with cool water mixed with herbs, yarrow to stop bleeding, willow bark for pain, roots whose names were spoken only in the old African tongues. The elder's hands moved gentle as prayer, but her eyes blazed with fury barely contained. "Hush now, child," she whispered, though Nora hadn't made a sound, couldn't make a sound with her mouth sewn shut. "I know it hurts something terrible, but you gonna live through this. Our people survived the Middle Passage, survived the auction block, survived things that would break lesser souls. This here? This just another trial on the road to freedom." Through the cabin's single window, Nora could hear the night sounds of the quarters. Babies crying, couples whispering, someone singing low a spiritual that carried all the sorrow of bondage. "Nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Nobody knows but Jesus." The voice belonged to old Moses, a man so ancient he claimed to remember being stolen from Africa as a boy. They said he could recall the smell of the slave ship's hold, the screaming darkness, the bodies that died chained beside him and weren't removed for days. His singing now was like a bridge between that terrible past and this terrible present. Nora tried to swallow, but even that simple act brought agony. Her tongue felt thick and useless behind the barrier of thread. Aunt Ruth had managed to get a little broth into her using a hollow reed as a straw, but most of it had dribbled out, mixing with blood and tears. "The old ones used to tell us stories," Aunt Ruth continued, her voice taking on that cadence of memory and mourning. "Back in the belly of them slave ships, when our ancestors lay chained in darkness breathing the stench of death and despair, they'd whisper to each other in languages the white men couldn't understand. Yoruba, Igbo, Ashanti, Mandinka, all them beautiful tongues speaking courage into the void." She paused, wringing out the cloth in a bowl of water now tinged pink with Nora's blood. "They said the spirits of the ocean, the drowned ones who jumped or were thrown overboard, they became powerful guardians. Said they swim beneath the ships even now, waiting to pull the wicked down to face justice in the deep." Nora's eyes, the only part of her face that could still fully express, filled with fresh tears. Not from pain alone, but from the weight of inherited trauma. The bone-deep knowledge that she was one link in a chain of suffering that stretched back across the terrible water and forward into an uncertain future. In them days of deep sorrow, you learned that the body can endure what the mind cannot imagine. But you also learned that endurance alone ain't enough. You need hope, even if it's just a spark in the darkness. A soft knock came at the cabin door. Aunt Ruth rose, opening it just a crack. Josiah stood there, his face carved with worry, holding a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "How is she?" he whispered. "Alive. That's about all I can say. I brought this." He handed over the bundle. "Found some wild honey in the woods. Thought maybe it might help with the pain, give her some strength, and..." He hesitated, glancing past Aunt Ruth to where Nora lay. "Tell her I'm sorry I couldn't stop it. Tell her I tried. Boy, you did what you could. Ain't no man can stop evil when it's wearing the overseer's face and carrying the master's authority." Aunt Ruth's voice softened. "But she know you tried. She seen you fighting to get to her." After Josiah left, Aunt Ruth brought the honey to Nora, managing to get a little of the golden sweetness onto her tongue through the corner of her sewn mouth. It was the first thing that didn't taste like blood and metal, and Nora closed her eyes in something almost like relief. But then the fever came. It started as chills that made her whole body shake, followed by heat that turned her skin fire-hot to the touch. The infection that every old slave woman feared had taken root in her torn flesh. Aunt Ruth worked through the night, applying poultices of mashed plantain leaves and spider webs, whispering prayers to Oshun and Jesus both, calling on every spirit and saint she knew to spare this young woman's life. Nora drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind wandering paths between waking and dreaming. She saw her mama standing on the auction block in Savannah again, but this time Sarah's mouth was sewn shut too, black thread crisscrossing her lips as she screamed silently for her daughter. She saw the ghost ship of the Middle Passage rising from dark waters, its hold full of chained souls still crying out in languages lost to time. In one fevered vision, she walked through a forest where the trees were made of bones, and the leaves were scraps of torn flesh. At the center stood a woman tall as the sky, her skin dark as midnight, wearing chains that had been transformed into jewelry. She spoke, but not with her mouth. Her words came from the earth itself, rumbling up through Nora's bare feet. "Child of the crossing, daughter of the drowned, you carry our voice now. Silence is just another form of speaking when the lips are sealed but the spirit blazes. Your suffering waters the seed of rebellion. From your pain will grow a forest of resistance." Nora tried to answer, to ask what it meant, but her sewn mouth wouldn't open. The woman smiled, sad and knowing. "You already understand, child. You always have." When Nora's eyes fluttered open again, weak morning light filtered through the cabin. Aunt Ruth slumped in the corner, finally sleeping after her long vigil. The fever had broken sometime in the night, leaving Nora weak as a newborn, but alive. Her face still screamed with pain. Her lips, grotesquely swollen around the black stitches, felt like they belonged to someone else. When she tried to move her jaw, even slightly, agony shot through her entire skull. But she was alive. And more than that, she was awake, aware. Her mind, freed from the constant need to speak, began to observe in ways she never had before. Through the cabin's cracks, she watched the other slaves preparing for another day of labor, to how they moved with practiced efficiency born of years under the whip. Noticed small acts of kindness, a woman sharing her meager breakfast with a sick child, a man helping an elder carry water, quiet gestures of humanity that bondage couldn't quite crush. She heard footsteps approaching, heavy boots that could only belong to one person. The cabin door crashed open, and Silas Crow filled the frame, his shadow falling across Nora like a stain. Well, he drawled, tobacco juice staining the corner of his mouth. "Still alive, I see. Good. Dead niggers don't learn lessons." He walked closer, boots tracking red clay across the dirt floor. Aunt Ruth woke with a start, positioning herself between Nora and the overseer. "Move aside, old woman. She's sick. Leave her be." "I said move!" Aunt Ruth stepped aside reluctantly, her hands clenched into fists, her eyes promising spiritual vengeance even if her body couldn't deliver earthly justice. Crow knelt beside Nora's pallet, studying his handiwork with satisfaction. "How's that mouth feeling, gal? Hurts, don't it? Good. That's 6 more days of hurting to go." He leaned close, his whiskey breath hot on her swollen face. "And when I take them stitches out, you gonna thank me. You gonna bow your head and say, 'Thank you, Master Crow, for teaching me my place.' You hear me?" Nora stared at him with eyes that refused to show submission. Couldn't speak, couldn't curse him, couldn't do anything but burn that look into him. A look that said clearer than words, "I will never bow. You can sew my lips, break my body, but my spirit you cannot touch." Crow saw that defiance and his face darkened. "Still got fire, huh? We'll see about that. We'll see how much fight you got left by day 7. He stood, brushing dirt from his knees. "And just so you know, I spread word to the big house that you attacked me unprovoked. Master Hawthorne's real pleased with how I handled it. Says I showed proper restraint, not just whipping you to death like I could've." He smiled, cruel and cold. "So if you thinking somebody gonna come save you, think again. Far as they concerned, you got exactly what you deserved." After he left, Aunt Ruth returned to Nora's side, her weathered face etched with sorrow and rage. "That man's soul is already damned," she whispered. "The ancestors watching. Justice coming, slow but certain as death itself." Outside, the morning bell rang, calling the slaves to labor. Nora heard them shuffle past her cabin, heading to fields that would drink their sweat like the earth drinks rain. 7 days stretched ahead like 7 lifetimes. Days of pain, of silence, of learning whether she had the strength to survive her own courage. But in the stillness of that morning, lying on her rough pallet with her face on fire and her mouth sealed shut, Nora made a silent vow. This suffering would not be in vain. This silence would teach her what words never could. And when those stitches finally came out, she would speak again, not in reckless rage, but with calculated purpose. The rebellion had only just begun. Now listen close, for this is where one woman's suffering became a whole community story, rippling outward like a stone thrown into still water, touching every soul in them slave quarters, whether they wanted to be touched or not. The second day after Nora's punishment, word spread through Willow Bend Plantation like wildfire in dry cotton. House slaves whispered to field hands. Children carried tales between cabins. Even the elderly who rarely left their pallets heard about the woman with sewn lips who'd cursed the overseer and lived to tell. Well, to live anyway, if not to tell. The reactions split the quarters clean down the middle like an axe through wood. Some saw Nora as a hero, a living testament to resistance, proof that their spirits could never be fully broken no matter what cruelty the white man devised. These folks would pass her cabin slow, leaving small offerings when the overseer wasn't watching. A bit of cornbread wrapped in cloth, a cup of buttermilk, wildflowers picked from the edge of the woods. Old Moses, who claimed to remember Africa, stood outside her window one evening and sang in a language even he didn't fully understand anymore. Words his grandmother had taught him, syllables that tasted of home and freedom. But others feared her recklessness, worried it would bring down suffering on all their heads. Hadn't they learned to survive by keeping quiet, by bowing their heads, by swallowing rage like bitter medicine? What good did speaking truth do when truth just got you tortured? That girl done put us all in danger, muttered Sarah Jane, a field hand who'd survived by never drawing attention. Now Crow's watching everybody twice as hard, looking for any excuse to punish. My boy got whipped yesterday for stopping to wipe sweat from his eyes, said it was slacking. That's Nora's fault, bringing down his wrath on all of us. Nora spoke what we all thinking, countered Big Jim, a man strong-backed as an ox who'd been plotting escape for years. She said out loud what we whisper in the dark. That take more courage than you or me got. In them days of deep sorrow, courage looked different depending on who was looking. To the broken, it looked like foolishness. To the unbowed, it looked like hope. Josiah walked both sides of that divide. By day, he picked cotton under Crow's watchful eye, his hands bleeding into the white bowls, his back bent like all the others. But by night, he became something different. A man transformed by love and anger into someone dangerous. On the third night after the sowing, he waited until the patrol had passed, until the quarters fell into that deep silence that comes just before midnight. Then he slipped from his cabin quiet as smoke, moving through shadows like he'd been born to them. The moon hung thin as a sickle in the sky, giving just enough light to navigate, but not enough to be seen. He reached Nora's cabin and tapped 3 times, soft, rhythmic. A code they'd developed without speaking. Aunt Ruth opened the door a crack, saw who it was, and let him in. Nora lay on her pallet, face still grotesquely swollen, the black stitches vivid against her skin even in the dim candlelight. But her eyes, Lord have mercy. Her eyes blazed when she saw Josiah, and something passed between them that needed no words. "I can't stay long," Josiah whispered, kneeling beside her. "Patty rollers making double rounds since what happened. But I had to see you. Had to know you still." He struggled for words. "Still you." Nora nodded slowly, careful not to move her sewn mouth. She reached for his hand, her fingers closing around his calloused palm with surprising strength. "Folks talking," Josiah continued, his voice low and urgent. "Some say you a fool, some say you a saint. Me? I think you the bravest woman I ever met. You said what needed saying, and damn the consequences." He pulled something from his pocket, a small cloth bundle. "Brought you this, found it in the woods by the creek. Honeycomb, like last time, but also..." He unwrapped it carefully. "Slippery elm bark. Aunt Ruth says you chew it to ease mouth pain, but you can't chew with your lips sewn, so I soaked it in water. Maybe you can get some of the medicine that way." Aunt Ruth took the bundle, nodding approval. "You a good man, Josiah. She lucky to have you caring for her." "Ain't about luck," Josiah said, his eyes never leaving Nora's face. "It's about..." He paused, searching for courage to speak what his heart knew. "It's about love. I love you, Nora. Been loving you since the first day I saw you in them fields and watching what they'd done to you." His voice broke. "I swear to God and all the ancestors, I'm gonna get you out of here. Gonna get both of us to freedom." In that moment, if Nora could have spoken, she would have told him yes. Yes to love, Yes to freedom. Yes to all of it. Instead, she squeezed his hand tighter, tears streaming down her swollen cheeks. And that squeeze said everything words couldn't. That's when they heard it. A sound outside the cabin. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, trying too hard to be quiet. Josiah froze. Aunt Ruth's hand went to the conjure bag hanging around her neck, fingers working the leather instinctively. Nora's eyes went wide with warning. The footsteps passed the cabin, then stopped. Whoever it was stood just beyond the door, listening, breathing, waiting. Someone's there, Aunt Ruth mouthed silently. Josiah moved toward the door, but the old woman grabbed his arm, shaking her head fierce. Confrontation now would mean death. Death for him, and likely for Nora and herself as well. They waited in terrible silence, hardly breathing, as the unseen listener stood outside for what felt like eternity. Then finally, the footsteps retreated, fading into the night. "Traitor!" Aunt Ruth hissed once she was sure they'd gone. "Someone watching, someone reporting back to Crow." "Who?" Josiah demanded. "Could be anybody. Plantation always got a few broken souls willing to betray their own for scraps from Master's table. Extra rations, lighter work, false promises of freedom." She spat on the dirt floor. "Judas was a slave too, you know. Sold his lord for 30 pieces of silver. Some folks sell their people for even less." Josiah's face hardened with rage. "If I find out who—" "You'll do nothing," Aunt Ruth cut him off. "Violence against one of our own just plays into their hands. Makes us look like the savages they claim we are. No, we handle this the old way. With patience, with wisdom, with power they can't see coming." She touched her conjure bag again, and in that gesture was the promise of spiritual warfare waged in shadows. Goofer dust in doorways, mojo bags buried at crossroads, curses whispered over grave dirt and bone. Josiah stayed a while longer, holding Nora's hand, whispering plans and promises. He spoke of the Underground Railroad, of safe houses he'd heard about in hushed tones, of the North Star that guided freedom seekers to liberty. He spoke of a future where they could marry proper, where their children would be born free, where Nora's voice, when it returned, could speak without fear of punishment. And Nora listened, letting hope and love war with the pain in her face and the fear in her heart. 6 more days of silence stretched ahead. 6 more days of healing. 6 more days to plan. When Josiah finally slipped back into the night, moving shadow quiet toward his own cabin, Aunt Ruth sat down beside Nora with a troubled expression. "We got problems, child. Someone watching you, someone listening to who comes and goes. That make escape plans dangerous. Make even loving dangerous." She paused, her ancient eyes seeing things beyond the physical world. "The spirits showing me betrayal coming. Coming from inside the quarters. Coming from someone close." Nora's eyes asked the question her sewn mouth couldn't. "Who?" "I don't know yet, but I'm gonna find out, and when I do—" Aunt Ruth's voice dropped to a whisper so cold it could freeze fire. "When I do, that traitor gonna wish Crow's needle and thread was the worst thing that ever happened to them." Outside, the thin moon set behind clouds. In the darkness that followed, shapes moved through the quarters, some heading toward the hush harbor in the woods for secret prayer, some going about more sinister business. And somewhere in that darkness, a betrayer walked among the betrayed, carrying secrets to the overseer's ear, selling their people for promises that would never be kept. Nora lay awake long after Aunt Ruth's breathing settled into sleep. Her face throbbed with relentless pain. Her heart ached with love for Josiah and fear for what tomorrow might bring. But underneath it all ran a current of steel, the same steel that had made her speak truth in the first place. "Let them watch," she thought. "Let them whisper and plot and betray. I survived the needle and thread. I'll survive this too. And when these stitches finally come out, when my mouth is my own again, I'll use it to speak freedom into existence, no matter who's listening." The night pressed down heavy on Willow Bend Plantation, and in the shadows between cabins, predator and prey walked the same paths, often not knowing which they were until it was too late. The third day dawned hot and mean. The kind of Georgia morning where the air sits thick as molasses and every breath feels like drowning on dry land. Nora woke to find her face swollen so bad she could barely see through slitted eyes. Her lips puffed around the black stitches like overripe fruit about to burst. But worse than the swelling was the heat radiating from her skin. Fever heat, the kind that meant infection had taken deep root in her torn flesh. Now you see, people, this is where the body's rebellion against suffering becomes its own kind of warfare. When flesh fights poison, when blood battles corruption, the soul gets caught in the crossfire. "Sweet Jesus," Aunt Ruth whispered, pressing her palm to Nora's forehead. The old woman's face, usually strong as carved mahogany, crumpled with worry. Child burning up like hellfire itself, this infection spreading fast. She moved quick despite her years, gathering herbs from hidden corners of the cabin, feverfew and bone-set, roots whose names were lost to all but the old ones who remembered Africa. Her hands worked with practiced urgency, crushing leaves in a wooden bowl, mixing them with spring water and whispered prayers. "The ancestors gonna have to fight for you now," Aunt Ruth murmured, applying the poultice to Nora's swollen face with fingers gentle as rain. "'Cause this fever trying to take you to the other side. In them days of deep sorrow, fever didn't just burn the body, it opened doors in the mind, let spirits walk through, showed visions that were half memory and half prophecy." And Nora, lying on that rough pallet with death circling close, began to see things that weren't there, and remember things that never happened to her but lived in her blood nonetheless. She saw her mama again, not sold on the auction block this time, but standing in the hold of a slave ship, chained to dozens of other women. The ship rocked violent on Atlantic waves, timbers groaning like the earth itself was crying out against such evil. Sarah's face was younger, smooth and unmarked by plantation suffering, and she spoke in a language Nora had never learned but somehow understood. "Daughter of daughters, child of the crossing, you carry our story in your bones. Every ancestor who survived the terrible water lives in you. Every soul who jumped from ship decks choosing ocean death over bondage swims in your veins. You think this pain is yours alone? No, child. This is our pain, passed down like inheritance, and you bearing it with the same strength we bore ours." "Mama!" Nora tried to cry out, but her sewn mouth wouldn't open, and the vision shimmered like heat mirage. The slave ship's hold multiplied, stretching into impossible dimensions. Hundreds of chained bodies lay in darkness so thick you could taste it. Men, women, children packed like cordwood, lying in their own filth, breathing death with every gasping breath. The stench was overwhelming. Vomit, blood, excrement, rot, despair given physical form. An old man chained next to Sarah turned his face toward Nora. His eyes held infinite sadness and terrible wisdom. "Remember us," he whispered in Yoruba, in Igbo, in Ashanti, in all the tongues stolen from stolen people. "Remember how we suffered so you could be. Remember how we died so you could live. And when your mouth opens again, speak our names into the air. Don't let us be forgotten." The fever climbed higher. Nora's body shook so hard the pallet rattled against the dirt floor. Aunt Ruth held her down, singing low in a voice cracked with age and fear. "Wade in the water, children. Wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water." But the water Nora waded through was the Atlantic itself, dark and cold and full of drowning screams. She saw them, the ones who'd jumped from the ships, the ones who'd been thrown overboard when sickness took them, the ones who'd starved themselves to death rather than accept bondage. They floated in the dark water like stars in a night sky, their eyes still open, still watching, still bearing witness. A woman with tribal marks scarred across her cheek swam up to Nora, moving through water like it was air. "We are the guardians now," she said, her voice bubbling up from ocean depths. "We who drowned became the spirits of the deep. And we hungry, child, hungry for justice, hungry to pull the wicked down to face what they done." "Help me," Nora tried to say, but water filled her sewn mouth, choking her. "We already helping. Who you think kept them stitches from infection this long? Who you think sent Aunt Ruth the knowledge of healing? We've been watching over you since before you was born, since your great-grandmother crossed the water in chains. You ours, and we don't let ours go easy." The vision shifted. Nora found herself standing on the auction block in Savannah, but she wasn't alone. Her mama stood beside her, and her mama's mama, and generations of women stretching back through time until the first one. A proud queen captured in a West African raid, iron collar around her royal neck, dignity unbroken despite the chains. "They can sew your lips," the queen said, her voice like thunder across water. "They can break your body, whip your back bloody, sell your children, steal your labor, but they cannot touch what lives inside. The part of you that remembers freedom. The part that knows your worth wasn't determined by some white man with a gavel and a bill of sale. Hold on to that, daughter. Hold on to it like life itself." "I'm trying," Nora whispered in the vision, "but it hurts so much." "Pain is the price of resistance," the queen replied. "Our people paid it crossing the ocean, paid it in the cane fields of Jamaica, the rice fields of Carolina, the cotton fields of Georgia. Every drop of blood, every broken bone, every stolen breath, it all waters the tree of rebellion. And that tree? It's growing, child, growing toward a day when chains break and auction blocks burn and freedom rings like church bells on Sunday morning." Back in the cabin, Aunt Ruth pressed a cool cloth to Nora's burning forehead. The fever had peaked now, hanging at that terrible edge where the soul decides whether to stay or fly free. The old woman's prayers intensified, calling on Oshun and Jesus, on Yemaya and the Holy Ghost, on every power she knew to fight for this young woman's life. "Don't you leave us, child," Aunt Ruth commanded, her voice fierce with love and desperation. "Too many people counting on you. Josiah out there planning your escape. The quarters watching to see if courage survives. The ancestors invested too much in your bloodline to let you go now. You hear me? You stay." Through the cabin walls came the sound of field songs drifting up from the cotton rows. 200 voices raised in harmony, singing work songs that hid maps to freedom in their verses. "Follow the drinking gourd, follow the drinking gourd, for the old man is waiting for to carry you to freedom if you follow the drinking gourd." The sound pulled at Nora like a rope thrown to a drowning woman. She grabbed hold of it, using those voices as an anchor to pull herself back from the edge of forever. Slowly, so slowly, the fever began to break. Sweat poured from her body, soaking the thin blanket beneath her. Her breathing, which had been shallow and rapid as a frightened bird's, deepened and steadied. The visions faded, leaving only memory and the certain knowledge that she'd been somewhere between life and death, and the ancestors had pushed her back toward life. When Nora's eyes finally opened clear, the light had changed. Hours had passed. Aunt Ruth sat slumped against the wall, exhausted from her vigil, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "You came back," the old woman sobbed. "Thank the Lord and all the saints you came back." But before Nora could even nod acknowledgement, the cabin door burst open. Silas Crow stood framed in sunlight like a demon emerging from hellfire, his shadow falling across Nora's weakened form. "Heard you was sick," he drawled, stepping inside uninvited, his boots tracking plantation dirt across the floor Aunt Ruth kept swept clean. "Thought I'd check if my handiwork was healing proper or if you was dying on me. Can't have you dying before you learn your lesson complete." He knelt beside the pallet, studying Nora's swollen, stitched face with satisfaction. "Look at that. Infection set in good. Face swole up like a tick on a hound dog." He laughed, the sound cold as January frost. "But you still breathing. That's good. That's real good. Means you got 4 more days to think about what happens when you run that uppity mouth." Aunt Ruth stepped between them, her small frame radiating protective fury. "She's sick, Crow. Leave her be." "Sick with her own foolishness," Crow spat. "Oh. And you best watch your tone with me, old woman, unless you want to see how needle and thread looks on your lips too." He stood, looking down at Nora with eyes empty of mercy or humanity. 4 more days, gal. Then we see if you learned anything. Then we see if that fire in your eyes finally gone out." After he left, Aunt Ruth returned to Nora's side, her hands trembling with rage and relief mixed together. "That man walking a dark road," she whispered. "The spirit's showing me his end and it ain't pretty. But before he fall, he gonna do more damage. We got to be careful, gotta be smart." Nora nodded weakly, understanding. The fever had shown her things. Terrible things, beautiful things, true things. And among them was the certainty that this suffering had purpose, that her sewn lips were becoming symbol. That resistance, even when it cost everything, planted seeds that would one day grow into forests. Outside, the afternoon sun beat down merciless on the slave quarters. But inside Nora's cabin, in the cool darkness where spirits walked close, a different kind of heat was building. The slow-burning fire of rebellion that no fever could extinguish and no overseer could sew shut. Listen here now, children, for this is where the soul descends into its deepest valley, where doubt gnaws like hunger and regret becomes heavy as chains. The fourth day after the sewing found Nora in that terrible place between broken and unbroken, between surrender and defiance, where every slave who ever lived has stood at least once, asking themselves if resistance is worth the cost. The fever had passed, leaving her weak as a newborn calf but clear-minded for the first time since the needle pierced her flesh. And with that clarity came questions that ate at her like infection. Was speaking truth worth this suffering? Was cursing Crow worth the pain that radiated through her face with every heartbeat? Was pride worth the danger she'd brought down on Josiah, on Aunt Ruth, on all the quarters? In them days of deep sorrow, regret didn't announce itself with trumpets. It crept in quiet-like, wearing the mask of wisdom, whispering that submission was just another form of survival. Nora sat on her pallet as morning light filtered through the cabin's cracks, her hands trembling as she touched her grotesquely swollen lips. The black stitches felt like iron bars imprisoning her voice. 3.5 days down, 3.5 to go. The halfway point of her sentence, and Lord have mercy. It felt like an eternity stretching in both directions. Aunt Ruth had gone to the fields, couldn't risk losing work time, or Crow would get suspicious, might even come snooping around the cabin more than he already did. So Nora sat alone with her thoughts, and they weren't kind company. Mama would have kept quiet, she thought, the words bitter as gall. Mama survived by bending like river reed in wind. She knew when to bow her head, when to say yes, master, even when everything inside screamed no. And she lived. She survived to see me grow. Would that have been the wiser path? Through the window she could see other slaves moving about the quarters, women washing clothes in wooden tubs, old folks too sick for fieldwork mending baskets, children too young for labor playing games in the dirt that mimicked auction sales and whippings. The cruel inheritance of bondage passed down like genetic memory. One child's voice carried clear on the morning air. "I'm the master, you the slave. Get on the auction block, nigger." The other children laughed, climbing onto an overturned bucket, pretending to be examined by invisible buyers, playing at the trauma that defined their existence, because children make games of everything, even horror. Nora closed her eyes against tears she couldn't afford to shed. Crying made her face hurt worse, made the stitches pull against swollen flesh. But the tears came anyway, silent and bitter, carrying all the weight of her doubt. What have I done? What have I accomplished besides bringing down wrath on people who can't afford more suffering? Josiah could get sold south for associating with me. Aunt Ruth could face the whip for tending me. The whole quarter's walking on eggshells because Crow's watching everybody twice as hard now, looking for any excuse to punish. A soft knock interrupted her spiraling thoughts. The door opened a crack, and a face peered in. Young Rebecca, a girl of 15 who worked in the big house kitchen. "Miss Nora, I brought you something." She slipped inside quick, glancing over her shoulder nervous-like. "Can't stay long. Mistress think I'm fetching water." She unwrapped a small bundle, a piece of cornbread with a bit of salt pork inside. Luxury food from the master's table that house slaves sometimes managed to sneak. "Thank you," Nora tried to say, but her sewn mouth turned it into a muffled groan. Don't try to talk, Rebecca said, her young face etched with sympathy and something else, admiration mixed with fear. Just wanted you to know what you did, standing up to Crow. Some folks say it was foolish, but she paused, choosing words careful-like. But I've been in that big house 5 years now, since I was 10, and I see things, hear things. Master Hawthorne preaches about Christian charity while buying and selling human souls. Mistress Catherine quotes scripture about kindness while ordering beatings for sport. It's all lies, Miss Nora, all of it. And you the only one brave enough to say so out loud. She pressed the food into Nora's hands. You gave us something to believe in, something to remember when we forget we're human. That's worth more than safety. After Rebecca left, Nora sat holding the cornbread, her mind churning with conflicting emotions. The girl's words had kindled something in her chest, a small flame against the darkness of doubt. But it wasn't enough to burn away all the regret. Not yet. As the day wore on, Nora forced herself to move, to observe, to think beyond her own pain. She positioned herself at the window where she could watch the comings and goings of the plantation. And in her enforced silence, she began to notice things she'd never paid attention to before. Crow's patterns, for instance. He rode through the quarters at the same times every day, dawn, noon, and dusk, like clockwork, predictable. That was knowledge worth having, stored away for future use. The guard's rotation, 3 men total taking shifts. The night watch was always old Pete, who was hard of hearing and liked his whiskey. Another piece of information filed away. The way supplies came and went from the big house. Which slaves had access to what? Who moved freely? Who was watched? The invisible architecture of the plantation revealed itself to her observing eyes. Silence is a weapon too, she remembered from her fever vision. The ancestor woman had said it clear. In silence, you could watch, listen, learn, prepare. By afternoon, Josiah appeared, bringing water from the well on the pretense of offering it to the sick. But really, he came to see her, to check if she still breathed, still fought, still loved. He sat beside her, their hands touching briefly, just long enough to feel the warmth of living flesh, the electric current of connection. Been thinking, he whispered, his voice barely audible. About what you said before they sewed your mouth. About being thieves of souls. He paused, his jaw working with emotion. You were right, Nora. Everything you said was right. And I've been wrong to stay quiet so long, to survive by swallowing my own spirit. He pulled out a small piece of bark, scratched words into it with a nail. We run when you heal. Nora read it, her heart hammering. She shook her head no, pointed at him, at herself, made a gesture encompassing the whole quarters. Too dangerous. Too many people could get hurt. But Josiah was insistent. He scratched more words. Staying more dangerous. Crow watching you. After stitches come out, he find new way to break you. We go north. Follow drinking gourd, the North Star. The Underground Railroad, freedom or death trying. The old story of their people, running toward hope through a wilderness of danger. Nora looked into Josiah's eyes and saw her own future reflected there. Not a future of submission, of bowed heads and swallowed rage, but a future of risk, of reaching for something that might kill them, but at least would let them die free. She nodded. Slow, deliberate. Yes, Josiah's face broke into a smile that transformed him, made him look like the man he could be in a world without chains. He kissed her forehead, gentle as prayer, then slipped away before anyone could notice how long he'd lingered. Alone again, Nora felt the weight of regret begin to shift. Not disappearing. No, it would never fully disappear. She would always carry the knowledge of pain she'd caused, danger she'd invited. But beneath the regret, something harder was forming. Something like purpose. Maybe speaking truth had consequences. Maybe resistance brought suffering. But silence, submission, that brought a different kind of death. The slow death of spirit, the gradual erasure of self until you became what they said you were. property, animal, thing. She would rather suffer with her humanity intact than survive as a broken shell. As evening fell over Willow Bend Plantation, Nora made peace with her choice. Not easy peace, the kind earned through fire and trial. She had 3.5 more days of stitched silence ahead. 3.5 days to prepare, to plan, to gather strength for what came after. Because when those stitches came out, she wouldn't thank Crow like he expected. She wouldn't bow her head or beg forgiveness. She would speak again, yes, but this time with calculated purpose instead of reckless rage. And then she would run. Run toward the North Star. Run toward freedom. Run toward a life where her voice could speak truth without fear of needle and thread. The regret was still there, gnawing at her like hunger, but it no longer controlled her. She had taken its measure, learned its weight, and decided to carry it forward as reminder rather than burden. The ancestors survived worse, she thought, touching the stitches one more time. They crossed the terrible water. They endured the auction block. They lived through horrors that would break lesser souls. I come from them. Their blood is my blood. Their strength is my strength. And if they could survive, so can I. If they could resist, so can I. If they could hope against all evidence that hope was foolish, so can I. Outside, the sun set red as blood over Georgia clay. Inside Nora's cabin, in the gathering darkness, a woman chose her future. And it was freedom or death, with no middle ground between. The 5th night came down soft and dangerous, bringing with it a sliver of moon that hung in the Georgia sky like a curved blade ready to cut. In the slave quarters, folks settled into their rough pallets, bones aching from another day of labor under that burning sun. But sleep didn't come easy. Not with patrols doubled and Crow's eyes everywhere, watching for any sign of rebellion brewing in the wake of Nora's punishment. Now listen close, for this is where love becomes the most dangerous thing a slave can carry. More dangerous than stolen food, more perilous than forbidden knowledge, more deadly than dreams of freedom itself. Nora lay awake in her cabin, the swelling in her face finally beginning to subside, though the stitches still pulled cruel against healing flesh. 2.5 days left of her sentence. 2.5 days until Crow would cut the threads and expect her gratitude, her submission, her broken spirit laid out like an offering. But Nora's spirit wasn't broken. If anything, it had been tempered in the fire of suffering, made stronger and sharper, like iron forged into steel. She heard it before she saw it. 3 soft taps on the cabin wall, the signal Josiah had used before. Her heart leaped, caught between joy at seeing him and terror at the risk he was taking. After the last visit, when they'd heard the traitor listening outside, coming back was madness. Pure, beautiful madness. Aunt Ruth wasn't there. The old woman had gone to tend to birthing in another cabin, leaving Nora alone, which meant no witness, no protection. Just 2 young people reaching for each other across the vast distance that slavery put between human hearts. Nora rose carefully, moved to the door, opened it just a crack. Josiah slipped inside like smoke, his presence filling the small space with warmth and danger both. "I know," he whispered before she could protest through gestures. "I know it's foolish. Know someone might be watching. But I had to see you. Had to." He paused, struggling with words that seemed too small for what he felt. "Had to be with you while I still can." He carried something wrapped in cloth, food stolen from who knows where, and more precious than gold. Cornbread and a piece of chicken, still warm. He'd risked whipping or worse to bring her nourishment, and the gesture said more than any poetry could. Nora pointed to the door, to the darkness beyond, made a gesture of listening ears. "Someone's watching," her hand said. "Let them watch," Josiah replied, his voice fierce and low. "Let them report to Crow. I'm tired of living like a hunted animal, always looking over my shoulder, always swallowing my own humanity. You taught me that, Nora. You with your sewn lips and unbroken eyes. You taught me that some things worth dying for." He knelt beside where she sat, took her hands in his. In them days of deep sorrow, touch became its own language. The only way to speak truths too dangerous for words. "I've been making plans," Josiah continued, his thumbs tracing circles on her palms. "Talk to Big Jim. He knows a man who knows a man. You know how it goes. There's a station on the Underground Railroad 3 days north of here. A Quaker family hiding runaways in their barn. We get there. They send us further north, Ohio. Maybe even Canada, where no slave catcher can touch us." Nora's eyes went wide. She grabbed his wrist, shook her head urgent-like. "Too dangerous. Too many could die." "Living here is dying slow," Josiah said. "Dying piece by piece till there's nothing left but a shell that picks cotton and says, 'Yes, massa,' and forgets it was ever human. That ain't life, Nora. That's just breathing while dead." He pulled something else from his pocket, a small cloth bag that looked familiar. Nora recognized it immediately. A mojo bag, the kind Aunt Ruth made for protection. Inside would be High John the Conqueror root, bits of scripture, graveyard dirt. Things of power meant to shield the wearer from harm. "Aunt Ruth made it for you," Josiah explained. "Said you gonna need all the spiritual help you can get for what's coming. Said the ancestors watching close, but even they can't protect you from everything. Said you gotta be smart along with brave." He tied the mojo bag around Nora's neck, his fingers lingering against her skin. The touch sent electricity through her body, the kind of feeling that reminded her she was alive, still capable of sensation beyond pain. "When them stitches come out," Josiah whispered, his face inches from hers, "we don't wait. We run that same night. New moon coming in 4 days, darkest night of the month. Perfect for traveling by North Star without being seen." Nora wanted to argue, wanted to point out all the ways the plan could fail, but looking into Josiah's eyes, she saw something that made her breath catch: hope. Real, dangerous, beautiful hope. The kind of hope that had carried their ancestors through the Middle Passage, that had sparked slave revolts from Haiti to Virginia, that had built the Underground Railroad one brave soul at a time. She nodded, slow and solemn, like taking a vow. "Yes, we run." Josiah's smile could have lit the darkness. He leaned forward, pressed his forehead against hers, and in that moment they weren't slave and slave, but man and woman, human beings reaching for something beyond bondage. "I love you," he breathed. "Love you more than I fear death, more than I fear the whip or the patty rollers or being sold downriver. You understand? You're what makes freedom worth chasing." Nora couldn't speak, but her eyes said everything. "I love you too, and I'd rather die free with you than live enslaved without you." They sat like that for a long moment, foreheads touching, hands clasped, breathing the same air. Outside, the world continued its cruel turning. Masters sleeping in soft beds, slaves dreaming of liberation, patrollers riding through darkness looking for runaways to brutalize. Then they heard it. Footsteps, approaching slow and deliberate. Heavy boots on hard earth, not trying to be quiet anymore. Coming straight for Nora's cabin with purpose that turned her blood to ice. Josiah pulled back, his hand going to the small knife he kept hidden in his boot. A pathetic weapon against what was coming, but all he had. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. A shadow fell across the crack, blocking the thin moonlight. Then a voice, cold and familiar as death itself. "I know you in there, boy. Saw you sneaking around like a thief in the night." Silas Crow. Lord have mercy on what came next. Nora's mind raced, searching for escape, for explanation, for anything that might save Josiah from what was about to happen. But there was nowhere to run in a cabin with one door, nowhere to hide when the devil himself stood on your threshold. "Come on out, Josiah," Crow drawled, his voice carrying that lazy cruelty of a cat playing with a mouse. "Or should I come in there and drag you out? Either way, you're gonna pay for sneaking around my plantation at night. Gonna pay for consorting with that uppity bitch who still ain't learned her lesson." Josiah stood, squared his shoulders, prepared to face whatever came. But before he could move toward the door, Nora grabbed his arm. Their eyes met one last time, and in that look past 1,000 words, a lifetime of love compressed into a single moment. "Run," her eyes said. "When the chance comes, run and don't look back." Not without you, his eyes replied. Never without you. The door crashed open. Crow stood framed in moonlight like a demon conjured from nightmare. His whip coiled at his side, 3 paddy rollers behind him with rifles and clubs and faces that promised violence. Well, well, Crow smiled, stepping inside. Ain't this touching? 2 niggers thinking they can have a love story like they was white folks, like they was people. He spat tobacco juice on the clean-swept floor. Time to wake up from that dream, boy. Time to remember what you are. He nodded to the paddy rollers. Take him. They surged forward, grabbing Josiah by the arms. He fought like a wildcat, landing 1 solid punch that broke a paddy roller's nose before they clubbed him down. Blood sprayed. Bones cracked. Nora tried to scream through her sewn mouth but could only manage muffled cries of anguish. Oh, you want to watch? Crow asked, grabbing Nora by her hair, forcing her to look. Good. You gonna watch what happens when slaves forget their place. Gonna watch what happens when they think love is something they're allowed to have. They dragged Josiah out into the night, his blood leaving a trail in the red Georgia clay. Other slaves emerged from their cabins, forced to witness yet another lesson in the pedagogy of terror that kept the plantation running. And Nora, held in Crow's iron grip, could only watch as the man she loved was dragged toward the whipping post, toward another chapter in the endless story of suffering that was slavery. But even as tears streamed down her face, even as horror threatened to overwhelm her, Nora felt something else rising in her chest. Rage. Pure, crystalline rage. The kind that burns through fear and doubt and regret, leaving only diamond-hard determination. This ends, she vowed silently, her hands clenching into fists. This all ends, and soon. The night swallowed Josiah's cries as the whip began to fall, each crack echoing across the quarters like thunder before a storm that would wash away everything in blood and fire, and the terrible price of freedom. Dawn broke ugly over Willow Bend Plantation, the sun rising red as fresh blood, casting long shadows across ground, still wet with what they'd done to Josiah. 20 lashes, 20 screams that tore through the night like fabric ripping, 20 stripes across his strong back that turned him from man to raw meat, all because he dared love in a place that forbade love among the enslaved. Now you see, people? This is where the serpent in the garden reveals itself, where trust curdles into betrayal, and the worst evil comes not from masters and overseers, but from broken souls among our own who trade their brother's blood for promises that will never be kept. Nora hadn't slept. Couldn't sleep with Josiah's cries still echoing in her ears, with the image of his back splitting open under Crow's whip burned into her mind's eye. She sat in her cabin as morning light crept through the cracks, her sewn lips throbbing with each heartbeat, her soul screaming with rage that had nowhere to go. Aunt Ruth had returned near dawn, her ancient face haggard with exhaustion and sorrow. She'd been at the whipping post all night, tending Josiah after they finally cut him down, applying poultices of spiderweb and moss to stop the bleeding, whispering prayers over wounds that might fester and kill him slow. He asking for you, Aunt Ruth said quietly, settling herself on the floor beside Nora. Keep saying your name through the pain. Boy's stronger than most, but... She paused, her hands trembling. Them 20 lashes was meant to break him. Break both of you. Show the whole quarters what happens when slaves think they can have something beautiful in this ugly world. Nora's hands clenched into fists. 2 more days. 2 more days until the stitches came out. 2 more days until she could speak, could scream, could spit her rage into Crow's face. But even rage had to wait on healing. There's something else, Aunt Ruth continued, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. Something you need to know about how Crow knew Josiah was coming to you last night. Nora's eyes snapped to the old woman's face, seeing knowledge there that promised pain of a different kind. We got a traitor, child. Someone been watching you close, reporting everything back to Crow. Who visits, what gets said, how plans getting made. Aunt Ruth's jaw tightened. And I know who it is. Before she could speak the name, a commotion erupted outside. Voices raised in anger and grief, the sound of scuffling, someone shouting denials that sounded hollow as a rotted tree. Nora and Aunt Ruth emerged into morning light to find the entire quarters gathered in a rough circle. At the center stood Big Jim and two other field hands, holding someone between them, a man whose face Nora recognized with sinking horror. Zeke, a slave of about 30 years, bent-backed from a lifetime picking cotton, with eyes that never quite met yours straight on. He worked the far fields, kept to himself mostly, never caused trouble. The kind of man who survived by being invisible. The kind of man nobody suspected. Found him sneaking back from the overseer's house, Big Jim announced, his voice carrying across the assembled slaves. Had coins in his pocket, silver coins. And we all know slaves don't get paid in silver unless they're selling something more valuable than labor. Zeke struggled in their grip, his face twisted with fear and shame. I wasn't. You got it wrong. Dewey. Big Jim shook him hard. Then explain the coins. Explain why Crow's boy Zeke suddenly got silver when the rest of us can't get enough cornmeal to fill our bellies. He gave it to me, said it was payment for extra work. Extra work? Aunt Ruth stepped forward, her small frame radiating spiritual authority that made even Big Jim step back respectful-like. What kind of extra work, Zeke? Spying on your own people? Listening at windows? Reporting who's planning to run, who's meeting in secret? Who's daring to love despite the chains? In them days of deep sorrow, there was no crime worse among the enslaved than betrayal. Because when you lived under the master's boot, the only thing keeping you human was solidarity. The knowledge that your people had your back, that suffering was shared, that resistance, even small and quiet, was collective. Betrayal broke that, turned the quarters into enemy territory, made every whispered conversation dangerous, every act of kindness suspicious. I had to, Zeke cried, tears streaming down his face. Crow said, he promised if I helped him, he'd let me buy my freedom. Said in 2 years I could earn enough to purchase my papers. What was I supposed to do? Stay enslaved forever while I got the chance to be free? Free? Big Jim's laugh was bitter as gall. You think Crow gonna honor that promise? You think a man who whips slaves for sport gonna suddenly turn benevolent and give you freedom? Boy, you dumber than I thought. He promised, Zeke shouted, desperate now. He swore on the Bible, and Massa swore on that same Bible that we was inferior beings meant for bondage, Aunt Ruth said coldly. That Bible been used to justify every evil under the sun. Don't mean the promise is true. The crowd pressed closer, anger building like pressure before a storm. Nora saw it in their faces, the desire for vengeance, for blood payment, for blood spilled. Josiah lay bleeding because of Zeke's betrayal. How many others had suffered? How many escape plans had been discovered and crushed? How many beatings had been delivered based on information this broken man had sold? We should hang him, someone shouted from the crowd. String him up like they do runaways. Let him swing till the buzzards come. No, another voice, too quick. We should do to him what he did to us. Make him suffer slow. The mob mentality was rising. That dangerous thing that happens when oppressed people turn their powerlessness against each other instead of their oppressors. Nora had seen it before. Slaves punishing slaves because they couldn't touch the masters, creating hierarchies of suffering within their own community. She stepped forward, pushing through the crowd despite her weakness. All eyes turned to her, the woman with sewn lips, the living symbol of resistance, the one who'd suffered most recently from Zeke's betrayal. What she did next shocked everyone into silence. Nora walked up to Zeke and looked him dead in the eyes. Not with hatred, not with rage, but with something far more powerful. Pity. Deep, soul-cutting pity for a man so broken by slavery that he'd sacrificed his own people for the illusion of freedom. Then she did something no one expected. She placed her hand on his shoulder, not in comfort exactly, but in acknowledgement. In recognition that they were all broken in different ways, all struggling to survive an evil so vast it corrupted everything it touched. Through gestures and looks, she communicated what her sewn mouth couldn't speak. Hatred only strengthens the master. Violence against each other is what they want. It distracts us from the real enemy. Aunt Ruth understood first. "She's right," the old woman said, her voice cutting through the crowd's bloodlust. "We kill Zeke, we just doing Massa's work for him. We turn on each other. We forget who the real devils are." "But he betrayed us," someone shouted. "Yes, he did," Aunt Ruth agreed. "And that's between him and his conscience, him and God, him and the ancestors who gonna judge him when his time comes. But we ain't God. We ain't judge and jury. We just people trying to survive. And survival means staying united against the real enemy, not tearing each other apart." The crowd wavered, bloodlust cooling under the cold water of Aunt Ruth's wisdom and Nora's silent forgiveness. Big Jim released Zeke, shoving him away with disgust. "You dead to us," he said simply. "We don't touch you, but we don't talk to you, don't help you, don't acknowledge you exist. You a ghost walking among the living. That's your punishment." Zeke collapsed to his knees, sobbing. "I'm sorry, God help me, I'm sorry, he promised, he lied. I just wanted to be free." "We all want to be free," Aunt Ruth said, not unkindly, "but not at the cost of our souls. Not by selling out our own. You made your choice, Zeke. Now you gotta live with it." The crowd dispersed, leaving Zeke alone in the dirt, weeping. Nora watched him for a moment, then turned away. Forgiveness didn't mean trust. Mercy didn't mean forgetting. She'd shown him grace because violence would have made them no better than their oppressors. But she would never forget what his betrayal had cost. That evening, as the sun set bloody over the plantation, word came that shook the quarters to its foundation. Zeke had been found hanging from a tree at the edge of the woods. Dead by his own hand, they said. Couldn't live with the shame and isolation. Couldn't face the ghost life Big Jim had sentenced him to. Or maybe, and this is what folks whispered in the darkness, maybe it wasn't suicide at all. Maybe Crow had silenced him permanent-like, tying up a loose end that knew too much about the overseer's methods. Either way, Zeke was dead. And the quarters had lost one more soul to the machinery of bondage. Not to whip or auction block, but to the slower poison of collaboration. The soul death that came from betraying your own for promises that turned to ash. Nora lay in her cabin that night, touching the mojo bag Josiah had given her, thinking about mercy and justice, betrayal and forgiveness. 1.5 days left until the stitches came out. 1.5 days until she could speak again. And when she did speak, it would be to say one word: run. Because staying in a place that broke men like Zeke, that whipped men like Josiah, that sewed lips like hers, staying was its own kind of death. Better to die free in the woods than live enslaved in the quarters. The ancestors whispered agreement in the wind. The 6th day arrived with a strange quietness hanging over Willow Bend, like the hush before a summer storm when even the birds stop singing, and the air grows thick with electricity. One more day. Just one more day until Silas Crow would cut the black threads from Nora's lips and expect her broken spirit laid out like a sacrifice at his feet. But listen here now, children, for this is where the fever returns. Not the fever of infection, but the sacred fever of vision. When the ancestors reach across the veil between worlds and speak truths that the living need to hear. Nora woke before dawn, her body drenched in sweat despite the cool morning air. The fever had come on sudden during the night. Not the burning sickness of infection, but something else. Something that felt like fire and ice running through her veins simultaneously, setting her nerves ablaze with sensation beyond the physical. Aunt Ruth was there immediately, her weathered hand on Nora's forehead. But this time, the old woman didn't reach for herbs or poultices. She recognized this fever for what it was. "The ancestors calling you, child," Aunt Ruth whispered, her voice filled with awe and fear mixed together. "Don't fight it. Let them in. Let them speak what needs speaking." Nora's eyes rolled back, showing only whites. Her body went rigid, then began to tremble like a leaf in high wind. And in that space between consciousness and dream, between life and the realm of spirits, she walked. She stood again in that impossible forest where trees were made of bones and leaves rustled with the voices of the dead. But this time, she wasn't alone. Around her gathered the women of her bloodline, her mama Sarah, her grandmother whose name she'd never known, generations stretching back until the first one captured in Africa and dragged across the Middle Passage in chains. They formed a circle around her, these women, their faces bearing marks of suffering but also of unbreakable strength. Some had scars from whips, some had brands burned into their skin, some had missing fingers, broken teeth, eyes that had seen horrors beyond naming, but all of them stood tall, crowned in spiritual light that no earthly darkness could extinguish. The first ancestor, the African queen Nora had seen before, stepped forward. She wore the iron collar of captivity, but somehow it looked like royal jewelry, transformed by the dignity she refused to surrender. "Daughter of daughters," the queen spoke, her voice like thunder rolling across ocean depths. "You have been tested. Needle pierced your flesh, thread sealed your mouth. Fever tried to claim you. Love brought suffering to the one you cherish. Betrayal came from within your own community. And through it all, you did not break." "But I wanted to," Nora tried to say, her dream voice working even though her physical lips remained sewn. "I wanted to submit, to bow my head, to beg forgiveness and just survive." "Of course you did," her mama Sarah said, stepping forward to stroke Nora's face with ghostly fingers. "You human baby. Wanting to survive ain't weakness. It's the strongest instinct we got. But you chose something harder than survival. You chose resistance. You chose to keep your humanity intact even when they tried to strip it away." Another ancestor spoke, a woman with ritual scarring across her cheeks that marked her as Yoruba nobility. "In the belly of the slave ship, when we lay in our own filth, when the stench of death filled every breath, we made a choice too. Some of us jumped into the ocean, choosing death over bondage. Some of us survived, choosing life even in chains. Neither choice was wrong. Both were acts of resistance against the unthinkable. But what do I do now?" Nora asked, her spirit voice cracking with emotion. "Josiah bleeding because of me. The quarters divided. Crow waiting to humiliate me one last time. How do I resist without bringing more suffering to those I love?" The queen smiled, sad and knowing. "Child, that's the question every resistor must answer. There's no easy path. Resistance always costs something, but submission costs more. It costs your soul, piece by piece, until nothing remains but an empty shell going through motions of living while already dead inside." She reached out, placing her hand over Nora's heart. The touch burned like fire and felt like coming home at the same time. "We give you this gift," the queen intoned, and suddenly all the ancestors were placing hands on Nora. Shoulders, head, arms, back, covering her in spiritual touch. The gift of clarity, the gift of purpose, the gift of knowing that silence itself can be a weapon when wielded with wisdom. Visions flooded through Nora then. Fast as lightning strikes, she saw herself standing before Crow as he cut the threads, her face calm as still water, giving him nothing, no gratitude, no submission, no broken spirit to feed his cruelty. She saw herself and Josiah running through darkness, following the North Star through swamps where patrollers couldn't track them, guided by the spirits of those who'd escaped before. She saw herself speaking to crowds of free people in the North, her voice strong and clear, telling the truth about slavery that newspapers called peculiar institution, as if it were anything less than pure evil. She saw her children she didn't have yet but would, born free, growing up knowing their mama had chosen freedom over safety, had risked everything so they could live unchained. And she saw Crow's end, saw him old and alone, haunted by the ghosts of all those he'd tortured, dying without peace, his name cursed by generations who would remember him as the monster he was. "The ancestors see everything," the queen whispered. "Past, present, future. It all exists simultaneously in the spirit realm. And we tell you this: your suffering was not in vain. Your sewn lips will become symbol. Your story will be told in slave quarters from Georgia to Virginia, inspiring others to resist in ways big and small. You are planting seeds, daughter, seeds that will grow into forests of freedom." "But Josiah will survive," Sarah interrupted. His back will heal, his spirit is strong, and together you will run. The Underground Railroad waiting. The Quaker family 3 days north ready to hide you. The path is dangerous, but you won't walk it alone. We'll be with you every step. Another ancestor spoke, this one bearing whip scars that crisscrossed her back like a map of suffering. When Crow cuts those threads tomorrow, you give him silence. Not the silence of defeat, but the silence of power. The silence of a woman who has looked into the abyss and emerged unbroken. Let him see in your eyes that he failed. That torture couldn't break you. That all his cruelty only made you stronger. And then? Nora asked. Then you wait for the new moon. Darkest night. You and Josiah run. Follow the drinking gourd north. Wade in water when you can to hide your scent from the dogs. Trust the conductors who'll show themselves by coded signs. And remember, freedom isn't just a place, it's a state of being. You already free in your spirit. Running just makes your body catch up to what your soul already knows. The visions began to fade. The ancestors started stepping back, dissolving into light and shadow. But before they disappeared completely, they spoke one last promise in unison, their voices blending into a sound like ocean waves, like wind through cotton fields, like the eternal song of resistance. We who crossed the terrible water, we who survived the auction block, we who built this country with stolen labor and broken backs, we who died in chains but never in spirit. We will walk with you, daughter, through swamp and forest, through danger and fear. Through every step of your journey to freedom, you carry us forward. And we carry you. Nora's eyes snapped open. She was back in her cabin, dawn light streaming through the cracks. The fever had broken again, leaving her weak but filled with crystalline clarity. Aunt Ruth sat beside her, tears streaming down her ancient face. You saw them, the old woman said. Not a question, but a statement. The ancestors came to you, Nora nodded. And what did they tell you? Through gestures and looks, Nora communicated what words couldn't. They told me to be ready. They told me I'm not alone. They told me freedom is coming and no thread can sew shut what the spirit demands to speak. Aunt Ruth pulled Nora into her arms, holding her like the daughter she'd never had. Then we prepare, child. We prepare for tomorrow and for the night after. We prepare for the run. And we trust that the same spirits who brought our people through the Middle Passage will guide you north to freedom. Outside, the plantation was waking. Slaves moving toward another day of labor. Overseers mounting horses to patrol the fields. The machinery of bondage grinding on like it had for generations. Like it would for generations more unless people like Nora chose to break the wheel. But inside that small cabin, in the space between heartbeats, something had shifted. Nora was no longer just a woman with sewn lips waiting for punishment to end. She was a warrior, blessed by ancestors, a freedom seeker preparing for the greatest journey of her life, a living testament to the truth that the human spirit cannot be permanently chained. Tomorrow, Crow would cut the threads. Tomorrow, Nora would look him in the eye and show him that torture had failed. And tomorrow night, when the new moon rose dark over Georgia, she would run toward the North Star with Josiah at her side and the ancestors at her back. The promise had been made, in blood and vision, in suffering and survival, in the space between worlds where the living and dead dance together, and the ancestors never break their promises. The seventh day came with a cruelty of its own. Bright sunshine mocking the darkness Nora carried inside. Birdsong cheerful as if the world wasn't built on stolen bodies and broken spirits. This was the day. The day Silas Crow would cut the threads from her lips and expect her gratitude, her submission, her soul served up on a platter of defeat. But now listen close, for this is where the student becomes the master, where suffering transforms into wisdom, and where silence speaks louder than any scream ever could. They came for her at noon, when the sun stood highest in the sky and cast no shadows. Crow and 2 patrollers, their boots heavy on the hard-packed earth outside her cabin. The whole plantation had been called to witness, just like they'd witnessed the sowing 7 days before. 200 souls assembled in a rough semicircle, forced to watch the conclusion of Nora's punishment, the final lesson in what happens when slaves forget their place. Nora emerged from her cabin with Aunt Ruth at her side. The old woman's hand rested light on her shoulder, not for support but for spiritual grounding, a reminder that the ancestors walked with them, invisible but present as the air they breathed. The assembled slaves parted to let them through. Some eyes held pity, some held admiration, some held fear that what had happened to Nora could happen to them. But all eyes watched as she walked toward the center of the gathering where Crow waited, his knife gleaming in the noonday sun. Josiah stood near the front of the crowd, his back still bandaged from the whipping he'd taken for loving her. Their eyes met across the distance, and in that look passed a world of meaning. Tonight, we run tonight. Be ready. He nodded, almost imperceptibly. I'll be ready. I love you. Master Hawthorne himself had come down from the big house for this spectacle, his Bible clutched to his chest like a shield against his own conscience. He stood beside Crow, preparing to deliver scripture that would somehow justify 7 days of torture as Christian discipline. In them days of deep sorrow, the Bible was weaponized against those it should have protected, twisted to support evil, used to sanctify suffering. But Nora had learned something in her week of silence. The same God who was used to justify slavery also inspired the spirituals, the resistance songs, the prayers for deliverance that echoed through hush harbors and slave quarters. God was too big to be owned by masters who claimed his blessing while denying his image in their slaves. "Gather round!" Master Hawthorne's voice boomed across the assembled crowd. "You all witnessed this slave's punishment 7 days ago, witnessed her defiance, her pride, her sinful rebellion against the natural order ordained by the Almighty himself." He opened his Bible, flipping to a marked passage. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 5. "Slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart, as you would Christ." This nigger forgot that commandment, forgot her place, forgot that obedience is not just law but divine mandate. The slaves stood silent, faces carefully blank. But beneath that blankness ran currents of rage, grief, and a growing understanding that the master's God and the slave's God might be two different beings entirely. Silas Crow administered just punishment, Hawthorne continued. 7 days with her lips sewn shut to teach her that words have consequences, that a slave's mouth should only open to say yes, master, and thank you, master. Now we shall see if the lesson took root. He nodded to Crow. "Remove the threads." The overseer stepped forward, grabbing Nora's face roughly with one hand, while the other brought the knife close. She didn't flinch, didn't pull away, just stood there, looking past him toward the horizon, toward the North Star she couldn't see in daylight, but knew was waiting in the darkness. "You gonna thank me proper when this is done," Crow whispered, low enough that only she could hear. "Gonna bow that proud head and tell me you learned your lesson. You hear me?" Nora's eyes shifted to meet his, and in her gaze he saw something that made his hand falter for just a moment. Not fear, not submission, but a calm certainty that shook him more than any curse could have. The knife slipped under the first stitch. Crow pulled, and the black thread came free with a small pop. Blood welled up where the thread had lived for 7 days, but Nora didn't make a sound. 1 stitch, 2, 3. Each thread removed brought fresh pain as scabs tore open, as healing flesh was disturbed. Nora's lips, swollen and scarred, slowly came free from their prison, but she remained silent, barely breathing, her eyes fixed on that invisible star. 4 stitches, 5, 6. The crowd watched, hypnotized by the ritual of it. Some remembered their own punishments, their own moments of humiliation designed to break spirits. Some saw in Nora's stillness a different kind of resistance, the refusal to give the overseer what he wanted, which was a show of her brokenness. 7. The final thread came free. Crow stepped back, pocketing his knife, waiting for what came next. Master Hawthorne leaned forward expectantly. The whole plantation held its breath. Nora's lips, freed after 7 days, trembled, swollen and scarred, Marked forever by the cruelty she'd endured, they parted slowly. Her tongue, unused to speech, tried to form words. This was the moment when she was supposed to bow, to thank, to show that torture had done its work. Instead, Nora did something that no one expected. She smiled. Not a big smile. Her lips couldn't manage that, still too swollen, too damaged. But a small, knowing smile that said clearer than words, "You failed. You tortured me for 7 days and I'm still here, still unbroken, still human despite everything you did to strip my humanity away." "Well?" Crow demanded, his voice tight with anger barely controlled. "Ain't you got something to say to me? Some gratitude for not whipping you to death like I could've?" Nora's smile widened just slightly. Then she opened her mouth and spoke her first words in 7 days. Her voice came out rough and damaged, barely above a whisper, but crystal clear in the noon silence. "Thank you." Crow's face broke into a triumphant grin. Master Hawthorne nodded approval. The lesson had been learned. The slave had been broken. But then Nora continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Thank you for showing me that evil has a face, and it looks like you. Thank you for teaching me that torture can only touch the body, never the soul. Thank you for proving that no thread can sew shut what the spirit demands to speak." The overseer's grin vanished. "What did you—" "Thank you," Nora continued, her voice rising now, carrying across the assembled crowd like a spiritual sung in the fields, "for reminding me that I come from people who survived the Middle Passage, who endured the auction block, who built this nation with stolen labor and still kept their humanity intact. Thank you for making me stronger than I knew I could be." "Shut your mouth!" Crow roared, his hand going to his whip. But before he could uncoil it, Master Hawthorne grabbed his arm. The master's face had gone pale, seeing something he hadn't anticipated. That punishment had backfired. That torture had created a martyr instead of breaking a spirit. "Let her speak," Hawthorne said quietly, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "Let her hang herself with her own words. Then we'll see about additional punishment." Nora looked directly at Crow, her scarred lips forming words with deliberate precision. "I forgive you. Not because you deserve forgiveness, but because hatred would make me like you. And I will never be like you. Never be the kind of person who finds power in another's pain. Never be so broken that cruelty is the only thing that makes me feel whole." She turned to address the assembled slaves, her voice carrying the cadence of the ancestors, the rhythm of resistance passed down through generations. "And to my people, remember this. They can chain our bodies, but never our spirits. They can punish our words, but never our thoughts. They can sew our lips, but never our dreams of freedom. We survive. We resist. We remember who we are despite everything they do to make us forget." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. 200 slaves stood frozen, hardly daring to breathe. They'd just witnessed something unprecedented. A slave speaking truth to power in the aftermath of torture, turning punishment into testimony. Crow stood trembling with rage, his whip hand twitching. But Master Hawthorne held firm, calculating the cost of further punishment against the risk of creating an even more powerful symbol of resistance. Finally, the master spoke. "Take her back to the quarters, double her workload for the next month. And if she speaks one more word of rebellion, we sell her south to the sugar plantations where the life expectancy is measured in years, not decades." But as the patrollers moved to escort Nora away, she made one final gesture. She touched the mojo bag hanging around her neck, Josiah's gift, Aunt Ruth's protection, the ancestors' blessing, and looked straight at Crow with eyes that promised this wasn't over. "Tonight," those eyes said, "tonight, I run, and you'll never touch me again." The crowd dispersed slowly, whispers spreading like wildfire. Josiah caught Nora's hand as she passed, squeezed it once, confirmation and promise both, and Aunt Ruth, walking beside her back to the cabin, whispered so softly only Nora could hear, "The new moon rises in 3 hours, be ready, child. Freedom calling and we gonna answer." The sun began its descent toward evening. and with it descended the curtain on Nora's time at Willow Bend Plantation. By morning, she would be gone, running through darkness toward the North Star, toward freedom, toward a future where her scarred lips could speak without fear and her unbroken spirit could finally soar. The hours between the thread cutting and nightfall stretched long as years, each minute heavy with anticipation and terror, mixed together like blood and water. Nora returned to her cabin under guard, supposedly to rest but really to be watched. Crow wasn't fool enough to miss the defiance in her eyes, the promise of rebellion in her scarred smile. Now you see, people. This is where resistance becomes tactical, where passion transforms into strategy, and where love demands the kind of courage that looks like madness to those who've never tasted freedom's possibility. Nora sat on her pallet, her newly freed lips throbbing with pain that felt almost sweet after 7 days of Sewn silence. Through the cabin's single window, she watched the sun descend toward the horizon, painting the Georgia sky in shades of blood and fire. Each degree of descent brought her closer to the new moon, to darkness deep enough to hide runaway slaves from patroller eyes. Aunt Ruth moved about the cabin with practiced casualness, but her hands were busy with purpose, gathering herbs, packing small bundles of food wrapped in cloth, preparing for a journey she was too old to make herself, but would help others begin. "They watch in the cabin," the old woman whispered, crushing pokeweed berries into a paste. "2 patrollers posted at the quarter's edge. Crow ain't stupid. He knows something brewing, even if he can't prove it yet." "Then how do we?" Nora started, her voice still rough and damaged. "Hush now. Save your voice, them lips still healing." Aunt Ruth glanced toward the window, calculating. "We got ways. The old ways. Ways the masters don't understand because they too busy thinking we ignorant to be clever." She handed Nora a small gourd filled with the pokeweed paste. "At midnight, you drink this. Make you sick as a dog, vomiting, fever, the works. They'll think the infection from your lips spreading. While they fetching the doctor from the big house, that's when you run. And Josiah, boy already knows," Big Jim told him. "He'll be waiting by the old oak at the edge of the cotton field. The one lightning struck last summer, left it half dead but still standing." Aunt Ruth's eyes grew distant with meaning. "Like our people, half dead from bondage but still standing, still reaching for the sky. In them days of deep sorrow, escape plans were whispered in code, passed through looks and gestures built on networks of trust that ran deeper than blood. The Underground Railroad wasn't just a route, it was a conspiracy of hope, maintained by people who risked everything to help strangers reach freedom." 3 days north, Aunt Ruth continued, her voice taking on that tone of sacred instruction. "Follow the drinking gourd till you reach the Chattahoochee River. Wade upstream for 2 miles to throw off the dogs. The water hide your scent. On the north bank, you'll find a willow tree with 3 notches cut in the bark. That's the sign. Wait there till you see a lantern swinging twice, pause, then twice again. That's the conductor, Quaker man name of Thomas Garrett. He'll hide you in his barn, feed you, send you further north when it's safe." She pressed a bundle into Nora's hands. Food, a change of clothes, flint and steel for making fire. Everything you need for the first leg. After that, trust the conductors. They've been doing this for years, smuggling souls to freedom one dark night at a time. "Aunt Ruth," Nora's voice broke with emotion. "Come with us, you could—" "Child, I'm near 70 years old. These bones too tired for running through swamps and dodging patrollers. My time for that kind of freedom done past." She cupped Nora's scarred face with gentle hands. "But you young, you strong. You got fire in your belly and ancestors at your back. You were meant for this, meant to run, meant to be free, meant to tell the story of what we survived." Through the window, movement caught Nora's eye. Josiah, pretending to carry water, passed close enough to the cabin to make eye contact. He touched his chest once, over his heart, then pointed north. "I love you. Tonight we go north." Nora touched her chest in response. "I love you too, I'll be ready." But then something else moved in the gathering dusk, something that made Nora's blood run cold. Silas Crow mounted on his black stallion, watching the quarters with eyes that missed nothing. He sat there in the half-light, still as death itself, and Nora knew with terrible certainty that he suspected something. "He knows," she whispered. "Maybe, maybe not." Aunt Ruth's jaw tightened. "But even if he suspect, he can't watch everywhere at once. That's our advantage, we many. He one man, even with patrollers helping. Somebody always gonna slip through the cracks." As full darkness descended, the quarters came alive with its usual evening sounds. Babies crying, couples arguing, someone singing a spiritual low and mournful. But underneath the normal noise ran currents of tension, of anticipation, of something building toward release. Big Jim appeared at the cabin door, his massive frame blocking the moonlight. "Time to move some pieces on the board," he said cryptically. "Got a distraction planned for midnight. Small fire in the tobacco barn, nothing serious but enough to pull the patrollers away from the quarters. Give you maybe 15 minutes to get clear." "You're risking too much," Nora protested. "Ain't no such thing as too much risk when it comes to freedom." Big Jim's smile was fierce in the darkness. "Besides, I've been planning my own run for years, just been waiting for the right moment, the right companions. Maybe your escape paves the way for mine. Maybe it inspires others. Revolution don't happen all at once. It happens one brave soul at a time, each one lighting a fire that spreads." He handed Nora something wrapped in oilcloth. A small knife, crude but sharp. "For protection. Hope you don't need it, but better to have it." After he left, Nora unwrapped the knife, testing its edge. The blade gleamed dully in candlelight, and she thought about how far she'd come from the house slave who polished silver in the big house. 7 days ago, she'd cursed Crow in reckless rage. Now she planned escape with calculated precision. Suffering had been her teacher, silence her classroom, and the ancestors her guides. The hours crawled toward midnight. Nora tried to rest but couldn't. Her mind raced with possibilities, with plans, with prayers to Jesus and the Orishas both. She touched the mojo bag around her neck, feeling the power in it. High John the Conqueror root, scripture verses, graveyard dirt. All the spiritual protection Aunt Ruth could muster. "Whatever happens tonight," the old woman said, breaking the silence, "remember you already free. Freedom ain't just a place you run to. It's a state of being. You've been free in your spirit since you cursed Crow in that cotton field. Running just makes your body catch up to what your soul already knows." Nora nodded, understanding. She thought about her mama, sold south all those years ago. Thought about the ancestors in the slave ship, about Zeke's broken betrayal, about Josiah's back torn open by the whip. Every one of them was a thread in the tapestry of bondage, but also a stitch in the quilt of resistance. As midnight approached, Nora drank the pokeweed paste. Within minutes, her stomach cramped violently. She began to vomit, to shake with fake fever that felt real enough. Aunt Ruth rushed out, calling for help, her voice carrying across the quarters. "She's sick! The infection's spreading! Need the doctor quick!" Patrollers came running, in the confusion of torches and shouting, of someone being sent to wake the doctor at the big house, of Crow riding up demanding to know what commotion was about. No one noticed a shadow slip from Nora's cabin. No one saw her move through the darkness between cabins, her feet knowing the path by heart. No one observed her reach the edge of the cotton field where a lightning-struck oak stood sentinel. And no one witnessed the moment when Josiah emerged from shadow, took her hand, and together they began to run. Not recklessly, but with purpose, following a route planned by others who'd escaped before, guided by the North Star that hung in the dark sky like a promise. Behind them, the tobacco barn erupted in flames. Big Jim's distraction perfectly timed. Shouts of "Fire!" echoed across the plantation. Bells rang. Slaves were roused to fight the blaze, and in the chaos of burning tobacco and running water, 2 souls slipped away into the Georgia night. Nora's scarred lips moved in silent prayer as they ran, her hand tight in Josiah's, her feet finding purchase on red clay she'd never see again. The ancestors ran with them. She felt their presence like wind at her back, like hands steadying her when she stumbled, like voices whispering encouragement in languages lost to time but living in blood. Freedom was north. Freedom was 3 days of dangerous running. Freedom was every step away from Willow Bend Plantation. And with each step, Nora felt chains she couldn't see begin to break. Not the chains on her body, but the ones wrapped around her spirit, her hope, her belief in tomorrow. They ran toward the Chattahoochee River, toward the willow tree with 3 notches, toward the Quaker conductor who would hide them and send them further north. They ran toward a future where Nora's voice could speak without fear, and Josiah's back could heal without fresh wounds being added. They ran toward life. Now listen here, children, for what I'm about to tell you happened in darkness so thick you could taste it. In woods so deep the spirits of the drowned walked alongside the living, guiding feet that stumbled toward freedom through a wilderness of danger and hope, mixed together like blood in water. Nora and Josiah ran for what felt like hours, their breath coming in ragged gasps, their bodies screaming from exertion. Behind them, the glow of the burning tobacco barn faded to a dull orange smudge on the horizon. Ahead lay nothing but darkness, and the distant promise of the Chattahoochee River where they'd wade upstream to hide their scent from the hunting dogs that would surely come. But freedom ain't free, and the road to it is paved with trials that test every ounce of strength a body possesses. They'd made it perhaps 3 miles when Josiah stumbled, crying out in pain. His whipped back, barely healed, had torn open again with the exertion of running. Blood seeped through his shirt, black in the moonless night. "Keep going," he gasped, pushing Nora forward even as he fell to one knee. "Don't stop for me. We go together or not at all," Nora said fiercely, her newly freed voice still rough but determined. She pulled him upright, taking some of his weight. "Aunt Ruth said 3 days to the safe house. We got time if we're smart about it." In them days of deep sorrow, love was the most dangerous cargo a runaway could carry. It slowed you down, made you vulnerable, gave you something to lose beyond your own life. But it also gave you reason to keep fighting when every muscle screamed surrender. They moved slower now, conserving strength, using the North Star to navigate through woods thick with pine and cypress. Spanish moss hung from branches like the ghosts of the drowned, swaying in wind that carried the scent of swamp water and wild magnolia. Hours passed. The night grew deeper, and then they heard it, the sound that turned hope to ice in their veins. Dogs, distant still, but unmistakable. The baying of bloodhounds on a scent, getting closer with every passing minute. Crow had discovered them missing faster than expected, had unleashed his hunting pack to track them down. "The river," Josiah said urgently. "We gotta reach the river. Water's the only thing that'll throw them off." They ran again, pain forgotten in the face of immediate danger. Through the trees ahead, Nora could hear the Chattahoochee's flow, Freedom's highway, the liquid road that had carried so many escapees north toward liberty, or death trying. But between them and the river rose an obstacle they hadn't anticipated. A patrol. 3 white men on horseback, torches held high, blocking the path to the water. Not Crow, he'd be riding with the dogs, but patrollers contracted to catch runaways for bounty money. The kind of men who'd shoot first and collect dead bodies for half the reward, rather than risk a chase. Nora and Josiah froze in the shadows, hardly daring to breathe. One wrong move, one snapped twig and lead balls would be tearing through their flesh. "Probably headed for the river," one patroller said, his voice carrying through the night air. "Always do. Think water gonna save 'em from the dogs. Never works. Dogs just pick up the scent on the other bank." "Waste of time if you ask me," another replied. "Niggers running north gonna die in them woods anyway. Cold, hunger, wild animals. Better off staying on the plantation where they fed and sheltered." The casual cruelty of it, the assumption that slavery was mercy, that bondage was protection, made Nora's blood boil. But rage was a luxury she couldn't afford. Survival required cold calculation. She tugged Josiah's sleeve, pointed away from the river, toward denser woods where the cypress trees grew thick from standing water. He understood immediately. They couldn't go through the patrol, so they'd go around, even if it meant heading away from their planned route. They moved like shadows, each step placed with agonizing care. Behind them, the dogs grew louder. Ahead, the patrollers sat their horses waiting, and all around, the Georgia wilderness pressed close with its own dangers. cottonmouth snakes in the water, wild boar in the underbrush, quicksand in the swampy places where solid ground disappeared without warning. Then Josiah's foot came down on something that moved, a snake, thick-bodied and deadly. It struck fast as lightning, fangs sinking into his calf. He bit down on his own hand to keep from screaming, blood flowing from where his teeth broke skin. Nora's heart stopped. A cottonmouth bite in the wilderness miles from help, with patrollers and dogs closing in. This was how escapes ended. Not in glory, but in slow death from venom or quick death from bullets. But she remembered Aunt Ruth's teaching, the knowledge passed down from conjure women who knew the old ways. She dropped to her knees, pulled the crude knife Big Jim had given her, and made a quick cut across the fang marks. Then she did something that required more courage than running. She put her scarred mouth to Josiah's wound and sucked the venom, spitting it out. Sucked again, spit again, praying to ancestors and Jesus both that she wouldn't swallow enough poison to kill herself while trying to save the man she loved. "Nora, stop," Josiah whispered through pain-gritted teeth. "You'll poison yourself. Leave me. Run while you can." "Never," she said, her voice fierce with determination. "We survive together or we die together, but I ain't leaving you." She tore a strip from her dress, bound his leg tight above the bite to slow the venom's spread. Not a perfect solution. Aunt Ruth could have done better with her herbs and knowledge, but enough to buy time, maybe. The dogs were close now, so close Nora could hear individual barks, could almost see torchlight flickering through the trees. The patrollers had heard the commotion, were riding toward them. They were trapped. No way to the river. No way to outrun horses and hounds. No way to fight off armed men with nothing but a small knife and wounded bodies. This was it. The moment when escape ended and recapture began, with all the torture that would follow. Whipping for Josiah, maybe death. Worse for Nora, who'd humiliated Crow publicly. He'd make her suffering legendary, a warning carved into her flesh that would echo through generations. But then, and folks swear on their lives this is true, a miracle happened. Or maybe not a miracle, but something the ancestors arranged, because the line between divine intervention and human courage is thinner than thread used to sew lips. The ground beneath their feet began to glow. Soft, greenish light emanating from fungus that grew on rotting logs. Foxfire, the old ones called it. Ghost light. Spirit shine. It lit a path through the swamp, showing solid ground where it existed, revealing safe passage through standing water. "Follow the light," a voice whispered. Whether in Nora's head or in the actual air, she couldn't say. But it sounded like her mama, like the African queen from her visions, like all the ancestors speaking in unison. "Follow the light and we'll guide you home." They followed, stumbling through swamp water that came up to their waists, moving through places where horses couldn't follow, where dogs would lose the scent in standing water. The foxfire guided them true, never leading them wrong, always showing the path that kept them from quicksand and deep water both. Behind them, the dogs reached the swamp's edge and stopped, whining. Wouldn't enter the ghost-lit water no matter how hard their handlers urged. Even animals knew better than to chase the dead's light into places where spirits walked. "They in the swamp," a patroller shouted. "Let 'em go. Ain't no nigger gonna survive in there at night. Cottonmouths and gators gonna do our work for us." The hunting party turned back, taking their dogs and torches with them. The sound of hoofbeats faded, and Nora and Josiah found themselves alone in the swamp, following Foxfire through darkness, with nothing but faith and ancestors to guide them. Hours passed. Josiah's legs swelled, but he kept moving, leaning heavy on Nora's shoulder. The venom made him delirious, made him see things. His mama who'd been sold when he was a boy, his siblings scattered across the South, the future children he and Nora might have if they survived this night. "Stay with me," Nora whispered, half carrying him now. "Just a little further, the light showing us the way. Trust the ancestors. Trust me." As dawn approached, the foxfire began to fade. But ahead, through thinning trees, Nora saw it, the Chattahoochee River, and on its far bank, a willow tree with 3 notches cut clear in its bark. They'd made it, against all odds. Through patrols and dogs and snakebite and swamp, they'd reached the first station, Nora helped Josiah across the river, the cold water reviving him slightly. On the north bank, she laid him gentle in the willow's shade and waited, praying that the Quaker conductor would come, that the signal would be given, that this nightmare of running was just beginning to end. As the sun rose red over Georgia, a lantern appeared in the distance, swung twice, paused, swung twice again. The code, the sign, the promise that the Underground Railroad was real, that freedom fighters existed, that not all white folks were devils. A man emerged from the trees, older, kind-faced, dressed plain like Quakers do. "Friends," he said simply, "thee are safe now. Come, my wagon waits nearby." Nora wanted to weep with relief but had no tears left. She just nodded, helped Josiah stand, and together they stumbled toward salvation, or at least toward the next leg of their impossible journey. But freedom, they were learning, wasn't a destination. It was a road walked one painful step at a time, with ancestors lighting the way, and love giving reason to keep walking, even when every bone screamed stop. Now gather round close, children, for this is where one story ends and another begins, where the price of freedom gets tallied in blood and sacrifice, and where choices made in darkness echo through generations yet unborn. Thomas Garrett, the Quaker conductor, hid Nora and Josiah in his barn beneath false floorboards, fed them broth and bread, tended Josiah's snake-bitten leg with poultices that slowly drew out the remaining venom. For 3 days they rested while patrollers scoured the countryside, while Crow raged and threatened, while Master Hawthorne posted rewards for their capture. $50 for Josiah, $100 for Nora, dead or alive. "Thee made powerful enemies," Garrett said quietly, changing the bandage on Josiah's leg. "The overseer Crow has sworn to hunt thee personally, says he'll track thee to the ends of the earth before he lets a nigger, forgive the crude word, but I quote his language, make a fool of him." "Let him try," Nora said, her scarred lips forming words with fierce determination. "I'd rather die free in these woods than live one more day under his boot." On the 4th morning, Garrett came to the barn before dawn, his kind face etched with worry. "We have a problem. Slave catchers arrived in town last night, professional hunters with trained dogs and rifles. They're searching every farm, every barn, questioning everyone. Someone must have informed them that runaways passed through here. In them days of deep sorrow, even the Underground Railroad had its weak links. People who talked too much, who got scared, who valued their own safety over others' freedom. Can we run?" Josiah asked, trying to stand but wincing as his injured leg protested. "Not far enough, not fast enough, not with thy leg still healing." Garrett paced, thinking hard. "There is another way, but—" He paused, the weight of what he was about to say hanging heavy in the barn's musty air. "It requires a sacrifice, a choice that may break thy hearts but save thy lives," he explained. The slave catchers were specifically looking for a man and woman traveling together, 2 runaways matching Nora and Josiah's description. If they stayed together, they'd be caught within days. But if they separated, if one went north immediately while the other hid longer, then followed a different route, their chances improved dramatically. The words hit like physical blows. After everything they'd survived, the sewing, the whipping, the escape, the snake bite, the swamp, now freedom itself demanded they part ways. "No," Nora said immediately. "We go together or not at all. That's what we promised." "And we'll both die together if we're stubborn," Josiah countered, his voice heavy with pain that had nothing to do with his wounded leg. "Nora, listen to me. You the one Crow really wants. You the one who humiliated him, who spoke truth in front of the whole plantation. He won't stop hunting you, but me? I'm just another runaway field hand. Without you, I'm less valuable, less of a priority. So, what are you saying?" Josiah took her hands, his eyes full of love and sorrow mixed together. "I'm saying you run first, get to freedom, and I'll follow when it's safer. We'll meet up north in Canada where no slave catcher can touch us, but right now, this moment, we gotta be smart instead of romantic." Thomas Garrett nodded sadly. "I have a contact leaving for Philadelphia tonight. A freight wagon carrying supplies. There's room to hide one person, not two. From Philadelphia, the path to Canada is well established, safe as any route can be for runaways. But the choice must be thine. Nora felt her world splitting in two. Every fiber of her being screamed to stay with Josiah, to refuse separation, to choose love over survival. But deeper than emotion ran the voice of the ancestors, the wisdom passed down through generations who'd made impossible choices in impossible circumstances. Sometimes love means letting go. Sometimes survival requires sacrifice. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is live to fight another day. "How long?" she whispered. "How long before you can follow?" 2 weeks, Garrett said. "Maybe 3. Time for the search to cool down, for new escapes to draw attention elsewhere. Then I'll send him north on a different route, through the mountains instead of the rivers." Nora looked at Josiah, really looked at him, memorizing his face, the scar above his left eyebrow, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the strength in his hands that had held hers through so much suffering. "Promise me," she said, her voice breaking. "Promise me you'll come. Promise me this ain't the last time I see you." "I promise," Josiah said, pulling her into his arms despite the pain it caused his injured back. "I'll find you, Nora. If I have to walk through fire and flood, if I have to face 1,000 crows, I'll find you. We didn't survive all this just to lose each other now." They held each other as the sun rose over the Quaker's farm, knowing these were their last moments together for weeks that might stretch into months, that might, God forbid, become forever if something went wrong. That night, Nora climbed into the false bottom of Thomas Garrett's freight wagon, surrounded by crates of dry goods and farming equipment. Through gaps in the wooden slats, she caught one last glimpse of Josiah standing in the barn doorway, his hand raised in farewell. Then the wagon lurched forward, and Georgia began to fade behind her, mile by painful mile, each rotation of the wheels carrying her further from bondage and from the man she loved in equal measure. The journey north took 2 weeks of hiding in attics and cellars, of traveling by night and sleeping by day, of constant fear that every knock on the door meant slave catchers. But the conductors were skilled, the safe houses secure, and Nora's determination unbreakable. She crossed into Pennsylvania, then New York, and finally, on a cold morning when frost covered the ground like scattered diamonds, she stepped across the border into Canada. Free soil, free air, freedom that tasted like tears and triumph mixed together. A conductor named Sarah, herself an escaped slave who'd made this journey years before, embraced Nora at the border. "Welcome to liberty, sister. Welcome home." But home felt incomplete without Josiah. Every day, Nora waited for news, for word that he'd left Georgia, that he was on his way, that their reunion was coming. Days became weeks. Weeks became a month. And then a letter arrived, carried by a conductor traveling north. Thomas Garrett's handwriting, formal and careful. "Friend Nora, it grieves me to report that thy companion Josiah was captured 3 nights past while attempting to leave my protection. Slave catchers discovered his hiding place. He fought bravely but was overpowered. He has been returned to Willow Bend Plantation. I am told the overseer Crow has him chained at the whipping post, using him as bait to lure thee back. Do not, I beg thee, fall into this trap. Josiah made me swear to tell thee, stay free, live. That is the only thing that makes his sacrifice worthwhile. He loves thee. He wants thee to survive even if he cannot." The letter fell from Nora's trembling hands. Josiah, captured, chained, suffering because of her, because he'd loved her, because freedom had demanded they separate and fate had been cruel in the separation. She stood at the window of the safe house in Toronto, looking south toward a country she'd escaped, toward a plantation she'd fled, toward a man she loved who was now paying the price for her freedom. And in that moment, Nora faced the hardest choice of her life: stay free in Canada, honor Josiah's sacrifice, live the life they'd both dreamed of, even if she had to live it alone, or return to Georgia, attempt a rescue that would almost certainly fail, throw away her freedom for the slim chance of saving the man who'd helped her escape. Her scarred lips moved in silent prayer. The ancestors whispered conflicting counsel, and the sun set red over Canada, painting the sky the color of blood and fire and impossible choices. What would Nora do? What price was she willing to pay for love? What did freedom mean if it cost her the person who made freedom worth having? The answer hung in the balance, unspoken, waiting for tomorrow's decision. And so the story pauses here, children, suspended between two futures. One safe but incomplete, one dangerous but whole. Because that's the truth of our people's journey. Freedom ain't never simple. Love ain't never easy. And the choices that define us are the ones that tear us apart even as they make us whole. Who suffered, suffered. Who resisted, left memory behind. And memory we keep here where the walls still echo with spirituals, where the ground still drinks tears, where the truth can't be sewn shut no matter how many threads they use. The ancestors walk among us still, bearing witness to what was endured and what was overcome. And their voices still sing, still testify, still call us to remember in these echoes from the quarters.